My name is Tara, 33 years old, and until last night I let my husband's wealthy family treat me like a stray dog. I was limping down a pitch-black freezing Connecticut road in the middle of a blizzard, clutching my 1-year-old son to my chest because my mother-in-law decided I did not deserve a coat, a car, or a safe place to sleep. She stole my keys and locked me out in the ice. My husband sat at the dinner table casually eating his steak while she did it. What they did not know was that my father's truck was about to pull out of the snowstorm, and the quiet, penniless housewife they loved to torture was about to dismantle their entire lives piece by piece. Before I tell you how their empire crumbled in a single night, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to destroy the people who underestimated your worth. The Connecticut winter wind whipped across my face like shattered glass as I stumbled down the icy shoulder of the road. I clutched my 1-year-old son Leo tightly against my chest, wrapping my inadequate sweater around his small, shivering body. The physical pain in my ankle was sharp, sending a jolt up my leg with every step I took in the mounting snowdrifts. But the emotional agony was infinitely louder. Be grateful we let you live here. Be grateful we let you live here. Patricia's voice repeated in my mind, a rhythmic, maddening loop of humiliation that synced perfectly with the crunch of my boots on the frozen asphalt. She had screamed those words at me right before slamming the heavy oak door of her mansion shut, locking me and my baby out in the middle of a brutal winter storm. I had no phone. I had no keys. I had absolutely nothing but the clothes on my back and the terrifying realization that the people who were supposed to be my family had casually discarded me to freeze in the dark. The streetlights flickered above, casting long, distorted shadows across the empty suburban road. My breathing was ragged, producing shallow gasps of freezing air that burned my lungs. Leo whimpered softly against my collarbone, his tiny hands gripping my sweater. I whispered soothing words to him, promising him that Mommy had it all under control, even as sheer panic clawed at my throat. I had walked maybe 2 miles from the sprawling estate that Patricia ruled like a tyrant. The cold was beginning to seep deep into my bones, making my fingers numb and my movements sluggish. I needed to find a gas station, a convenience store, anywhere with a working telephone and a heater. The neighborhood was painfully quiet. The massive houses were set far back from the street behind iron gates and manicured hedges, completely oblivious to the desperate mother limping past their driveways. My mind raced with the sheer absurdity of my situation. I was an educated, capable woman. Yet over the last 4 years, Patricia and my husband David had systematically stripped away my visible independence, painting me to the outside world as a helpless dependent. They loved the narrative of the poor dropout who desperately needed their charity. They fed on my silence, assuming my patience was a sign of weakness. Every insult, every slight, every financial restriction was deliberately designed to keep me under their thumb. And tonight, they had crossed the ultimate line. Endangering my child was a catastrophic mistake they would never be able to undo. I kept putting one foot in front of the other, channeling my anger into physical momentum to keep myself moving forward through the freezing storm. Just as my strength began to falter, a pair of bright headlights pierced the swirling snow behind me. I turned around, squinting against the glare, terrified it might be my husband David coming to drag me back for another round of his mother's psychological torture. The vehicle slowed down its heavy tires, crunching loudly over the ice. It was a rugged, dark gray truck. The passenger window rolled down, letting out a thick blast of warm air. I blinked against the snow, and my heart nearly stopped. It was my father, William. He was returning from a long business trip, driving the back roads to avoid the highway pileups. He looked at me, his eyes widening in absolute shock as he took in my snow-covered hair, my shivering frame, and the baby bundled inside my arms. He slammed the truck into park and threw open his door, rushing around the hood. He did not ask what I was doing out there. He did not ask if I was crazy. He simply looked at my empty hands and asked where my car was. His voice was thick with a dangerous, quiet rage. I looked at him through the freezing rain, my teeth chattering so hard I could barely form the words. I told him my mother-in-law took it. I told him she snatched my keys and said I should be grateful they let me live there. My dad went completely silent for a second. The wind howled around us, but all I could focus on was the terrifying stillness in his eyes. He is a man who deals with distressed debt, a man who spends his life navigating the worst of human nature and financial ruin. But he has always been a gentle, quiet father to me. His simple, practical clothes always made Patricia sneer with elitist disdain. She thought he was just some blue-collar nobody. She had absolutely no idea who she was actually dealing with. My father looked me dead in the eyes, his jaw set in stone. "Get in," he commanded, his voice slicing through the winter storm. "This ends tonight." He gently took Leo from my arms, securing him safely in the warm cabin of the truck, and then helped me climb into the passenger seat. The heat blasted over my frozen skin, but the warmth doing the most good was the realization that I was no longer fighting this battle alone. I buckled my seatbelt, my hands shaking violently as the adrenaline spiked. My father climbed back into the driver's seat. He did not turn the truck toward his own house. He slammed the gear shift into drive, spun the steering wheel hard, and accelerated back in the exact direction I had just come from. We were heading straight back to the mansion, straight into the heart of the conflict. I looked at his hands gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles white with barely contained fury. The time for keeping the peace was over. The time for polite smiles and biting my tongue had officially expired. Patricia and David thought they could break me by tossing me out into the snow. They thought I would come crawling back, begging for their mercy. They were horribly, entirely wrong. As the truck plowed through the snowdrifts, leaving deep tire tracks in the fresh powder, I felt the last remnants of my fear melt away. I was ready to face them, ready to expose every lie they had told, and ready to reclaim everything they thought they had taken from me. The ride back was not a retreat. It was the beginning of an absolute reckoning. Inside the heated truck, my father sped toward the sprawling brick mansion, the heavy tires gripping the icy road with relentless purpose. The rhythmic thumping of the windshield wipers served as a ticking clock counting down the minutes until my family would face the severe consequences of their cruelty. I stared out the passenger window at the dark, snow-covered trees blurring past us, and the traumatic events of the evening replayed in my mind with crystal clarity. The nightmare had started exactly 2 hours ago, right in the middle of our overly formal family dinner. Patricia had meticulously arranged the dining table with her expensive crystal and polished silver, projecting the image of absolute wealth and sophistication she desperately craved. The roast beef was perfectly cooked, the wine was flowing, and the atmosphere was thick with the usual suffocating tension that accompanied any meal in that house. My sister-in-law Beatrice sat across from me, casually swirling her expensive wine. She is the undisputed golden child of the family, a woman whose entire existence revolves around luxury spa treatments and belittling anyone she deems beneath her. Beatrice dramatically sighed and complained that her imported sports car was in the shop for detailing. She looked directly at her mother and whined that she simply had to attend an exclusive resort spa the next morning, but had no suitable vehicle to get there. Patricia did not even miss a beat. She turned her sharp, predatory gaze toward me and extended her hand across the table. "Give Beatrice your car keys, Tara," she demanded, her voice leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "She needs your SUV tomorrow." I paused, my fork hovering over my plate. I calmly explained that I could not give Beatrice my car because I needed it. Leo had a crucial follow-up appointment with his pediatrician early the next morning regarding his recent ear infection. I told Patricia it was impossible to reschedule, and I needed my vehicle to safely transport my baby. Patricia scoffed, rolling her eyes as if my son's health was a minor inconvenience to her social calendar. She leaned across the polished wood and snatched my keyring right off the counter where I had placed it earlier. "You do not have a vehicle, Tara." Patricia hissed, her face contorting with disdain. "David pays the insurance on that car. That makes it family property, and this family dictates how its property is utilized. You sit at home all day contributing absolutely nothing. You do not need a car to sit around and be a leech. A leech. Just a leech. The words struck me like physical blows, echoing the years of financial abuse and gaslighting I had endured under her roof. A leech. Just a leech. She loved to use that word, love, to remind me that I was a woman who brought zero financial value to her prestigious bloodline. I sat there absorbing the insult, letting the repetition of her cruelty wash over me. It was a calculated psychological tactic she used to keep me feeling small and dependent. She wanted me to believe that without her son, I would be destitute. What Patricia did not know, what none of them knew, was that my silence over the years was not born out of weakness. It was born out of strategy. I had allowed them to believe their own narrative because it kept them blind to the reality I was building right under their noses. I looked at Patricia's manicured hand resting possessively over my car keys. The sheer audacity of her entitlement was staggering. She truly believed she owned everything and everyone in her orbit. Beatrice smirked at me from across the table, taking a slow sip of her wine, clearly relishing my public humiliation. She had always hated me, viewing me as an intruder who diluted her mother's attention and financial resources. Taking my car was not about needing transportation to a spa. It was a power play, a deliberate demonstration of dominance designed to prove that my needs and the needs of my son would always be entirely subordinate to the whims of the golden child. I took a deep breath, fighting to keep my voice steady and reasonable. "Patricia," I said slowly, trying to appeal to whatever tiny shred of maternal instinct she might possess. "Leo needs to see his doctor. The weather is getting worse. I am not asking for a favor. I am telling you that I need my keys to take care of your grandson." I reached across the table, my hand outstretched, expecting basic human decency to finally override her need for control. I expected her to realize that denying a baby medical care was a line even she would not cross. Instead, Patricia's face darkened with a terrifying wrath. Her eyes narrowed into cold, unfeeling slits. She viewed my boundary as an unforgivable act of insubordination. In her world, no one defied her, least of all the daughter-in-law she viewed as a charity case. She slammed her hand down on the table, making the silverware rattle against the fine china. "You do not tell me what you need in my house," she barked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You do not make demands of me. You are a guest here, a guest who has overstayed her welcome and forgotten her place. I am the one who provides the roof over your head. I am the one who allows you to eat at this table. You are nothing but a leech draining my son dry." The word echoed in the dining room again. Leech. It was a brand she tried to burn into my identity. I felt the heat rising in my cheeks, a mixture of profound embarrassment and boiling rage. For years I had played the part of the meek, submissive wife to keep the peace. I had tolerated the passive-aggressive comments, the exclusion from family decisions, and the constant reminders of my perceived inferiority. But threatening my ability to care for my son was the catalyst that shattered my restraint. I was no longer willing to play the victim in her twisted psychological game. The illusion of family harmony was officially dead, and the ugly, undeniable truth of their cruelty was laid bare on the dining room table. I immediately looked across the polished mahogany table to my husband. David was the man who had vowed to protect me, the father of the child whose health was currently being treated like a massive inconvenience. I expected him to drop his fork. I expected him to finally draw a hard line and tell his mother that denying our infant son medical care was an absolute boundary she could not cross. Instead, David sat in cowardly, deafening silence. He meticulously sawed into his medium-rare steak, his eyes fixed firmly on his plate, as if the cut of meat was the most fascinating puzzle in the world. He was a covert narcissist who thrived on his mother's immense wealth and approval. He was completely content to let me serve as the family scapegoat, as long as it kept his trust funds secure and his mother in a favorable mood. "David," I pleaded, my voice trembling with a potent mixture of disbelief and violently suppressed anger. Please, tell your mother I need my car. We have to take Leo to the clinic in the morning. Tell her to give the keys back right now. The silence that engulfed the dining room was suffocating. Patricia sat back in her ornate chair with a smug, victorious smile, watching her son like a hawk, monitoring its prey. She knew exactly what he would do. She had spent 35 years training him to be her absolute financial and emotional puppet. Finally, David set his silver knife down. He let out a long, highly dramatic sigh, as if I were a toddler throwing an embarrassing tantrum over a useless toy. He looked at me with cold, empty eyes that held absolutely zero warmth for the woman he married. "Tara, just drop it," David mumbled, picking up his crystal wine glass and refusing to hold my gaze. "Mom is right. Beatrice needs the car for her spa appointment. Stop causing unnecessary drama at the dinner table over nothing. It is just a routine doctor visit. You can figure it out without ruining everyone's evening. Just order an Uber." The betrayal hit me harder than any physical strike ever could. He was throwing his own sick infant under the bus just to avoid mildly inconveniencing his spoiled sister. I looked around the table at the faces of my so-called family. Beatrice was grinning widely, tapping her manicured fingernails against the table in a rhythm of pure amusement. Patricia was practically glowing with toxic satisfaction. They were a pack of wolves, and I was the isolated prey they enjoyed tearing apart. "I will not take an Uber in a raging blizzard with a sick baby when I own a perfectly functional vehicle," I stated, my voice hardening into pure steel. I pushed my heavy chair back and stood up, reaching across the table. My hand extended toward my keyring, resting dangerously close to Patricia's plate. "Give me my keys, Patricia." I never even saw her hand move. Before my fingers could brush the metal ring, Patricia grabbed her heavy crystal goblet filled to the brim with dark red wine. With a vicious, calculated flick of her wrist, she hurled the entire glass of wine directly at my chest. The freezing liquid hit me with a shocking splat, soaking instantly through my light-colored wool sweater. The dark crimson stain bloomed across the fabric like blood dripping down my front and splattering loudly onto the expensive imported marble floor. I gasped, stumbling backward, my hands flying up to my chest. The sheer malice behind the action left me completely paralyzed for a fraction of a second. Beatrice laughed out loud, a cruel mocking sound that echoed off the high ceilings. She pointed at my ruined sweater, thoroughly entertained by my sudden physical degradation. "Oh my God!" a deep voice bellowed from the far end of the table. It was Jamal, Beatrice's husband. Jamal is a high-level corporate compliance lawyer, a brilliant African-American man who usually kept his head down and his mouth shut to survive the toxic environment of the estate. He was an outsider just like me, but he had always chosen silent complicity over conflict. Not tonight. The sight of a mother being assaulted over her child's health was his breaking point. Jamal leaped to his feet, his heavy oak chair scraping violently against the marble floor. "Patricia, what is wrong with you?" Jamal yelled, grabbing a pristine cloth napkin and reaching out to hand it to me. "That is assault. You cannot treat her like that. This has gone way too far." "Sit down, Jamal," Beatrice hissed, her voice cracking like a leather whip. She lunged upward, grabbing the lapel of Jamal's expensive custom suit jacket. She yanked him downward with surprising aggressive force. "Do not you dare intervene," she sneered, her fingers digging deep into his shoulder. "Tara brought this on herself by disrespecting my mother. She is a leech who needs to be taught a harsh lesson. Mind your business before I make you regret it." Jamal froze. I watched the profound humiliation wash over his face. He looked at me with eyes full of desperate, silent apology, but he slowly sank back into his chair. He surrendered his dignity to keep the peace in his own toxic marriage, trapped by the same financial chains that bound David. I was entirely on my own. "Get out of my house!" Patricia roared, standing up and pointing a trembling, manicured finger toward the grand foyer. "You are a hysterical, ungrateful street rat. How dare you speak to me like that in my own home? You want to cause a scene in my dining room? You can go outside and cool off. Go pack your baby and get out of my sight until you learn some basic respect." I looked at David one last time. He had returned to cutting his steak, casually taking a bite, as if his mother had not just assaulted his wife and ordered her out into a severe winter storm. He had made his definitive choice. He chose his mother's vast wealth and approval over the safety of his own family. The betrayal was absolute, cleanly severing the very final thread of loyalty I held for him. I did not say another word. I did not cry. I turned on my heel, the wet fabric of my sweater clinging uncomfortably to my freezing skin. I marched directly into the living room, scooped Leo out of his playpen, and walked straight out into the freezing night. I expected David to follow me to stop his mother, to do absolutely anything a real husband would do to protect his wife and child. Instead, as I stepped off the porch and onto the icy walkway, I heard the heavy mahogany front door slam shut behind me. A second later, the unmistakable heavy metal click of the deadbolt echoed through the freezing air. They had actually locked me out. They had thrown a mother and a sick infant into a blizzard because I dared to ask for my own car keys. They believed they held all the power. They believed I was trapped, dependent, and entirely at their mercy. They had no idea that locking that door was the catalyst that would bring their entire fraudulent empire crashing down. The violent memory evaporated as my father's heavy truck hit a massive snowdrift, jolting me violently back to the present reality. The heater in the truck cabin was blasting, but my blood was running cold with pure adrenaline. William's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles were stark white in the dashboard light. We tore down the final stretch of the suburban road, the massive iron gates of the estate looming ominously in the headlights. The gates had been left open for the private snowplows. My father did not even touch the brakes. The heavy truck roared through the entrance and fishtailed wildly into the circular driveway, the tires throwing up massive arcs of white powder. He slammed the truck into park right on the pristine front lawn, stopping mere inches away from the grand marble steps. "Wait here with the baby," my father commanded, his voice a low, terrifying growl that left no room for argument. "Keep the doors locked and the engine running." I watched through the snow-streaked windshield as William stepped out into the raging storm. He did not look like a corporate executive or a polite father-in-law. He looked like a man ready to tear a brick building apart with his bare hands. He stomped up the marble steps, his heavy winter boots leaving deep imprints in the fresh snow. He did not search for the doorbell. He did not politely knock on the glass. He simply lifted his heavy work boot and kicked the center of the solid mahogany doors with the explosive force of a battering ram. The sound of the impact was absolutely deafening. It cracked through the howling wind like a cannon shot. The reinforced deadbolt, the exact same lock I had just heard click shut to seal my fate in the ice, groaned and tore straight through the expensive wooden doorframe. Jagged splinters of mahogany flew across the pristine marble floor of the grand foyer. The heavy double doors crashed violently inward against the interior walls, the force shaking the expensive oil paintings hanging in the hallway. The sudden breach sucked the warmth right out of the house, letting the howling blizzard roar into the sacred silence of Patricia's perfect domain. I could not just sit in the truck and wait. My father had explicitly told me to stay put, but this was my life, my husband and my abuser. I checked that the truck doors were locked and the heater was running on high, ensuring Leo was perfectly warm and safe in his car seat. Then I stepped back out into the freezing wind, wrapped my arms tightly around myself, and followed my father's heavy footprints up those snow-covered marble steps. As I crossed the threshold into the ruined foyer, the scene unfolding in the formal living room was frozen in time. Classical music was playing softly from hidden surround sound speakers, an absurdly peaceful soundtrack to the violence of the storm blowing through the doorway. Patricia, David, and Beatrice were standing together by the roaring stone fireplace. They were holding delicate crystal flutes filled to the brim with expensive vintage champagne. They were actually toasting. They were smiling, laughing, and celebrating throwing a mother and a sick baby out into the freezing night. The violent shattering of their front doors wiped the smug, arrogant smiles right off their faces. Beatrice let out a sharp, terrified gasp, her hand jerking so violently she spilled her expensive drink down the front of her imported silk blouse. David physically recoiled. He dropped his crystal glass entirely, letting it shatter on the stone hearth with a sharp crash that pierced the sudden heavy silence. My husband looked absolutely terrified, his eyes darting frantically between my father's imposing silhouette and the swirling snow blowing in from the open doorway. My brave, successful husband, the man who let his mother abuse his wife for years, was now visibly trembling and shrinking behind a decorative velvet armchair. My father stepped fully into the bright light of the crystal chandelier. He did not bother to wipe his boots. Thick clumps of melting snow and dark mud dripped from his heavy coat directly onto the antique Persian rug that Patricia prized above all else. He stood there like a relentless force of nature, a mountain of quiet fury, staring down the people who had tortured his daughter. Patricia was the very first to recover. Her initial shock quickly morphed into deep, arrogant outrage. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, vicious condescension. She set her champagne flute carefully on the mantelpiece and smoothed her tailored slacks, lifting her chin as if she were preparing to discipline an unruly, disobedient servant. She looked at my father's rugged work coat and worn boots, completely miscalculating the man standing in front of her. "Well, look who decided to crash our private family dinner," Patricia mocked. Her voice echoed off the high ceilings, dripping with toxic venom and elitist disdain. "Did you come to shovel the driveway, William? Or are you here to apologize for the absolute trash you raised? Because if you are here to beg for her to come back inside, you are entirely too late. I've had enough of her disrespect." My father did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He took one slow, heavy step forward. The sheer intimidation radiating from him was palpable, filling the massive room and suffocating the oxygen out of the air. "Give me my daughter's car keys, Patricia," my father said. The quiet, unyielding menace in his tone sent a shiver down my spine, even though I knew he was entirely on my side. "Hand them over right now." Patricia laughed. It was a sharp, grating sound that bounced off the walls and grated against my nerves. "Your daughter's keys," she scoffed, waving her manicured hand dismissively in the air. "You mean the keys to the vehicle my son pays the insurance on? The vehicle that legally belongs to this family?" "I do not think so, William. Tara has proven she does not know how to respect the people who generously keep her off the streets. She needs to learn her proper place. And you, bursting into my home like a common thug, is not going to change the rules of my house." David finally found his voice, stepping slightly out from behind the velvet chair. "Sir, you need to leave right now," he stammered, trying desperately to sound authoritative but failing miserably. "You are trespassing on private property." Tara was acting hysterical. Mom just gave her a timeout to cool off. My father slowly turned his piercing gaze toward David. "A timeout," William repeated the words, dripping with absolute disgust. "You let your mother lock your wife and your sick infant son out in a blizzard for a timeout. You are not a man, David. You are a coward playing dress-up." David swallowed hard, his face turning a deep shade of crimson, but he did not dare step a single inch closer. Beatrice scoffed from the fireplace, crossing her arms defensively. "Oh, please, Tara is just dramatic. She probably just walked down the driveway to make a scene and play the victim like she always does." My father ignored them both and locked his eyes back onto Patricia. "I will not ask you again, Patricia," he warned. The silence in the room stretched until it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. "Hand over the keys right now, or I will consider this grand theft auto, and I will handle it accordingly." Patricia's wicked smile broadened into a full, predatory grin. She was completely oblivious to the massive danger she was courting. She truly believed that her generational wealth and elite social status made her utterly untouchable. She reached into the pocket of her tailored slacks and pulled out her cell phone. She held it high in the air like a weapon of mass destruction, the screen glowing brightly in the dim, firelit room. She looked right past my father, locking her cruel, triumphant eyes directly onto mine as I stood shivering in the shattered doorway. "Are you going to handle it, William?" Patricia sneered, her voice echoing with triumphant malice. Because I have already handled it. She took a slow, victorious step forward, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of the kill. You see, I just got off the phone with the local police department and Child Protective Services. I reported a mentally unstable, severely depressed, unemployed mother wandering the streets in a blizzard with a freezing infant. I told them she was having a violent psychotic break and threatened to physically harm the child because she was angry at her husband. My blood ran completely cold. The sheer evil of her strategy paralyzed my lungs. She was not just trying to take my car or kick me out of the house to teach me a harsh lesson in submission. She was trying to legally destroy me. She was weaponizing the authorities to brand me as an unfit mother, institutionalize me, and permanently steal my son. The authorities are on their way right now, Patricia whispered, her voice laced with venomous delight. They are going to take that baby from you, Tara. You are losing custody tonight, and you are going to watch it happen while standing helplessly in my foyer. The wail of the sirens began as a faint, distant shriek over the howling blizzard before rapidly amplifying into a deafening mechanical roar. Red and blue strobe lights violently pierced the swirling snow, casting frantic alternating shadows across the shattered mahogany wood of the grand foyer. The authorities Patricia had summoned to destroy me had arrived with terrifying speed. Two local police cruisers and an unmarked black sedan skidded to a halt on the icy driveway right behind my father's heavy-duty truck. Through the open doorway, 4 police officers rushed up the marble steps, their hands hovering cautiously over their utility belts. Close behind them hurried a stern-looking woman clutching a thick clipboard, clearly the emergency caseworker from Child Protective Services. They stepped over the splintered remains of the heavy deadbolt, their thick winter boots crunching loudly against the snow-covered Persian rug. The officers immediately fanned out their eyes, scanning the chaotic scene in the entryway, the imposing figure of my father, the shattered front doors, and me standing freezing in the draft with a dark, wet stain spreading rapidly across my chest. Before the lead officer could even open his mouth to assess the situation, Patricia launched into an Oscar-worthy performance. The vicious, predatory grin vanished from her face in a millisecond, instantly replaced by a mask of profound, trembling terror. She gasped dramatically, clutching her diamond necklace with one hand and reaching out toward the officers with the other. "Officers, thank God you are here!" Patricia cried out, her voice quivering with expertly manufactured panic. She shrank back against the stone fireplace, pulling Beatrice close as if shielding her from imminent violence. "That man kicked my front doors in. He is a violent intruder. And my daughter-in-law," she pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at me, "she has completely lost her mind. She ran out into a freezing blizzard with my defenseless grandson. She is having a psychotic break. Please, you have to protect us from them." The lead officer, a tall, broad-shouldered man, immediately held up his hands in a calming gesture. His eyes darted downward to the glowing red light of his body camera, ensuring it was recording the entire interaction. "Ma'am, please stay calm," he instructed Patricia firmly, before turning his sharp gaze toward me. He took in my shivering frame, the baby bundled safely against my chest, and the dark red stain that looked terrifyingly like blood. "Are you Tara?" he asked, his tone laced with heavy suspicion. I simply nodded, keeping my posture entirely straight and composed despite the freezing air biting at my exposed skin. I did not raise my voice. I did not frantically defend myself. I knew exactly how this game was played. The more hysterical a woman acts while defending her sanity, the more unstable she appears to the authorities. I held Leo securely, projecting absolute maternal calm amidst the sheer madness of the room. The CPS worker stepped forward, her eyes locked onto the crimson stain on my light wool sweater. "Ma'am, are you injured?" she asked, her voice tight with professional concern. "What is that substance on your clothing?" Before I could answer, Patricia let out a loud, theatrical sob. She did that to herself. Patricia wailed, her lies escalating with breathtaking speed. She was screaming about how we were trying to control her, and she just snapped. We tried to stop her, but she grabbed the baby and ran out into the ice. The lead officer turned his attention to David, who had finally stepped out from behind the decorative velvet armchair. "You are the husband," the officer asked, pulling a small notepad from his chest pocket. Sir, we need to know exactly what is going on here. Is your wife a danger to herself or this child? This was the definitive moment. This was the exact crossroad where a man either stood up for the mother of his child or completely surrendered his soul to his abuser. I looked directly into David's eyes, offering him one final silent chance to tell the truth. David looked at me, his gaze entirely devoid of human empathy, and then he turned his back to me and faced the police officer. He threw his own wife directly to the wolves. Yes, officer, I am her husband, David said, adopting a sorrowful, heavily burdened tone. He lowered his head, rubbing the back of his neck as if deeply exhausted by my supposed mental illness. My wife has been highly unstable for months. She refuses to seek professional help. She does not make a single dime. She is completely dependent on us for everything: food, shelter, clothing. My mother graciously lets us live here rent-free, and Tara repays her with constant paranoia and severe delusions. I stood in the freezing foyer, my face a mask of stone, as the father of my child systematically assassinated my character to the authorities. She imagines that we are all plotting against her. David continued, his voice dripping with fake husbandly concern. Tonight she just snapped over a minor disagreement about a vehicle. She started screaming, grabbed our sick son, and intentionally ran out into the blizzard just to punish me. She is not in her right mind, officer. She is deeply unwell, and I am terrified for my son's safety. The CPS worker aggressively scribbled notes onto her clipboard, nodding sympathetically at David's performance. It was the perfect, classic narrative of the benevolent, wealthy family burdened by a crazy gold-digging dependent. Beatrice nodded vigorously in agreement from the fireplace, dabbing at her perfectly dry eyes with a cocktail napkin. My father shifted his weight, his heavy boots grinding against the marble floor. I could feel the sheer explosive rage radiating from him. He opened his mouth ready to completely dismantle David right then and there, but I subtly reached out and placed my freezing hand firmly on his forearm. I squeezed twice, signaling him to stand down and let them speak. I wanted them to talk. I wanted them to keep spinning their intricate web of absolute perjury. I stared directly at the glowing red light of the lead officer's body camera. Every single lie Patricia cried out, every false accusation David solemnly delivered, every claim of my financial dependence and mental instability was being perfectly recorded by the local police department in high-definition audio and video. They thought they were burying me, but they were actually handing me the exact shovel I needed to dig their graves. The lead officer closed his notepad and took a cautious step toward me, his hand resting near his radio. Ma'am, under the circumstances, I am going to have to ask you to hand the child over to your husband, he instructed, his voice brokering absolutely no argument. We need to have emergency medical services evaluate you, and CPS will need to conduct a temporary placement assessment regarding the infant. Please do not make this difficult. Patricia let out a loud sigh of profound relief, a wicked, triumphant smirk, briefly breaking through her terrified facade. She looked at me with eyes that promised my utter destruction. You are going to a psychiatric ward, Patricia mouthed silently behind the officer's back. I gently adjusted my grip on Leo. He was sleeping peacefully against my collarbone, completely oblivious to the legal warfare happening around him. I looked at the lead officer, then at the CPS worker, and finally at my husband. I will not be handing my son to anyone. I stated, my voice echoing clearly and calmly through the freezing foyer, and I will not be undergoing any psychiatric evaluation. The officer's face hardened into a scowl. Ma'am, this is not a negotiation. You have been accused of severe child endangerment by your family. If you do not hand over the baby voluntarily, we will be forced to remove him physically. I smiled. It was a cold, sharp smile that finally made David flinch and step backward. They are not my family, officer, I replied smoothly, keeping my eyes locked on the camera lens. They are my tenants, and the people you are currently taking statements from are actively committing felony perjury. The lead officer narrowed his eyes, his hand slowly dropping away from his radio. The sheer conviction in my voice, entirely devoid of the hysteria Patricia had promised them, clearly caught him off guard. Patricia immediately lunged forward, desperate to regain control of her crumbling narrative. "Officer, do not listen to her," Patricia shrilled, pointing a manicured finger at my face. "She is delusional. She is making up insane lies to cover up the fact that she tried to freeze my grandson to death." "That is enough!" My father's voice boomed, slicing through Patricia's frantic screeching. William reached inside the inner pocket of his heavy snow-covered work coat. The officers instinctively tensed, but my father simply withdrew a sleek high-definition tablet and a small SD card adapter. He did not raise his voice. He operated with the lethal, terrifying calm of a man who held all the winning cards. "My name is William." My father addressed the lead officer and the CPS caseworker directly. "Patricia assumes I am just a blue-collar nobody because I prefer practical boots over designer suits. What she does not know is that my firm specializes in distressed debt and hostile corporate asset recovery. Bypassing the embarrassingly outdated security matrix of this estate took my team exactly 4 minutes while this family was busy eating dinner." He slid the SD card into the tablet and tapped the screen. I pulled the footage from the dining room cameras, the front porch security feed, and the dash cam of my truck. William explained, handing the glowing tablet directly to the lead officer. The CPS worker immediately leaned over the officer's shoulder to watch. "I believe you will find this highly relevant to your investigation." The entire foyer fell completely silent save for the howling wind outside and the crystal-clear audio playing from the tablet's speakers. From my vantage point, I watched the faces of the authorities as the digital evidence played out. They saw the high-definition footage of our formal family dinner. They heard me calmly asking for my car keys to take my sick infant to the doctor. They watched David, the so-called terrified husband, meticulously cutting his steak and telling me to take an Uber in a blizzard. They heard Beatrice mocking me. And then, clear as day, they watched Patricia grab her crystal goblet and viciously hurl freezing red wine directly at a mother holding a baby. The CPS worker let out a sharp, audible gasp as the audio of Patricia screaming, "Get out of my house!" echoed from the tablet. The video then seamlessly cut to the exterior porch camera. The authorities watched me walk out into the freezing snow, holding Leo tightly to my chest. They heard the heavy mahogany door slam shut. They heard the definitive metallic click of the deadbolt locking me out in a lethal winter storm. Finally, the footage cut to my father's truck dashcam, showing me limping down the pitch-black, icy road covered in snow and shivering violently miles away from the estate. The lead officer handed the tablet back to my father. The dynamic in the room inverted so fast it caused severe whiplash. The CPS worker's sympathetic demeanor toward David vanished, replaced by a look of absolute, unfiltered disgust. Patricia was hyperventilating, her eyes darting frantically around the room. "That video is manipulated," she stammered, her voice losing its elite polish. "He doctored that footage. It is out of context." I did not give them a single second to breathe. I handed Leo gently into my father's strong arms, reaching into his coat pocket to retrieve his cell phone. "Since we are establishing facts," I said, looking directly at the CPS caseworker, "let us verify my supposed mental instability and child endangerment." I quickly dialed a number from memory, hitting the speakerphone button and holding the device up for the authorities to hear. The phone rang twice before a crisp professional voice answered. "Dr. Eris Thorne speaking. William, is everything all right? It is late." "Dr. Thorne, it is Tara," I said clearly. "I am currently on speakerphone with the local police department and a caseworker from Child Protective Services. My mother-in-law and my husband have just reported that I am severely delusional, mentally unstable, and a violent danger to Leo. They claim I am entirely unfit to parent." "What absolute garbage!" Dr. Thorne's voice barked through the speaker, the sheer indignation in his tone making David physically flinch. "Officer Caseworker, listen to me very carefully. I am the chief of pediatrics at Mercy Hospital. Tara is one of the most brilliant, devoted, and perfectly sane mothers I have ever encountered in my 30 years of medical practice. She is fiercely protective of that boy." The CPS worker stepped closer to the phone. "Dr. Thorne, the husband, David, claims he is terrified for his son's safety." Dr. Thorne let out a harsh, barking laugh that completely destroyed David's lingering dignity. "David, the husband that is rich, I have been treating Leo since the day he was born, and I have never once seen David step foot inside my clinic. He has never attended a single checkup, vaccination, or emergency visit. Tara handles absolutely everything. She is the sole caregiver for that child. Dr. Thorne paused, his voice dropping into a deadly serious register. In fact, Tara has an urgent appointment scheduled with me tomorrow morning at 8 sharp to check on Leo's severe ear infection. If anyone is endangering that child, it is the family attempting to deny him medical care. If you need me to drive down to that estate right now to testify to Tara's absolute fitness as a mother, I will grab my coat. That will not be necessary, doctor. Thank you for your time. The lead officer said, his voice heavy with authority. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my father's pocket. The silence that swept through the grand foyer was catastrophic for the ruling family. The invisible empire Patricia had built on lies, manipulation, and financial abuse was rapidly crumbling into dust right in front of her eyes. The CPS worker furiously scratched out the notes on her clipboard, the harsh sound echoing off the marble floor. She turned her fierce gaze toward David. You utilized an emergency child protection hotline to punish your wife for asking for her car keys. She reprimanded, her voice shaking with professional outrage. You weaponized my agency while actively denying your sick infant access to his pediatrician. You sicken me. David opened his mouth to formulate an excuse, but no words came out. He looked like a cornered rat, completely stripped of his mother's protective armor. The lead officer stepped aggressively toward Patricia, his hand resting firmly on his utility belt. He invaded her personal space, forcing the arrogant matriarch to look up at him. Mrs. Wilson, the officer stated, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Filing a false police report is a severe criminal offense. Wasting emergency resources and deliberately lying to sworn officers regarding child endangerment carries mandatory jail time. You just initiated a fraudulent panic because you wanted to play God with your daughter-in-law's life. Patricia's jaw dropped. The wealthy, untouchable tyrant was suddenly realizing that her money could not bribe away high-definition video evidence and federal perjury. Beatrice tried to quietly inch her way toward the hallway to escape the fallout, but a second officer immediately stepped into her path, pointing a firm finger at the floor, silently ordering her to stay exactly where she was. We are not done here, the lead officer continued, his eyes scanning Patricia, David, and Beatrice. Not even close. The heavy silence that followed the officer's warning lasted exactly 2 seconds before Patricia's carefully constructed facade completely imploded. The realization that she was no longer the one pulling the strings, that her massive wealth could not buy her way out of federal perjury on police body cameras, sent her into a blind, entitled rage. She stomped her expensive heel against the marble floor, her face turning a mottled, furious shade of red. Are you actually threatening me in my own home? Patricia shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the high ceilings. She pointed a trembling finger directly at the lead officer's chest. I pay your salary. I know the mayor. I know the chief of police. You are going to arrest this hysterical street rat for trespassing and disturbing the peace right now. She is banned from this property. I want her removed immediately. The lead officer did not even blink. He crossed his arms over his Kevlar vest, thoroughly unimpressed by her frantic name-dropping. Ma'am, you do not dictate who gets arrested, he stated coldly. And considering you just filed a fraudulent report regarding a child's safety, I highly suggest you lower your voice and cooperate before you leave this estate in handcuffs. Now, where are the keys to the vehicle? Patricia gasped, clutching her pearls in a final desperate attempt to assert dominance. She is not getting that car. Patricia spat, turning her venomous glare toward me. I do not care what your little video shows. That vehicle is family property. My son pays the premium on the auto insurance every single month. That makes it a marital asset, and as the head of this household, I am seizing it until she learns to respect her superiors. She can walk to the shelter for all I care. David finally found a shred of courage, though he used it entirely to support his mother's delusion. He stepped forward, puffing out his chest in a pathetic display of authority. Mom is right, Officer David said, his voice dripping with unearned arrogance. I handle the finances for my wife. I pay the insurance on that SUV. She has zero income. The car stays here in our secure garage. You can escort her off the premises. The sheer audacity of their gaslighting was almost impressive. They had spent years stripping away my financial autonomy, restricting my access to joint accounts, and belittling my past achievements to the point where they actually believed their own lies. They had convinced themselves that I was entirely destitute and dependent on their charity. I did not waste my breath arguing with them. I shifted Leo's weight slightly in my arms, balancing him securely against my hip. I reached my free hand deep into the side pocket of the bulky diaper bag slung over my shoulder. I always kept my most vital documents hidden inside a waterproof pouch in the lining of that bag, fully aware that Patricia was entirely capable of searching my room and destroying anything that gave me a shred of independence. I pulled out a crisp, folded piece of thick paper and smoothed it out with one hand. I took a deliberate step forward, ignoring Patricia's vicious glare, and handed the document directly to the lead officer. "That is the original notarized title to the SUV sitting in the driveway," I stated, my voice ringing with absolute, unshakable clarity. The lead officer unfolded the heavy paper, his eyes quickly scanning the official state seals and the typed text. The CPS worker leaned over, inspecting the document right alongside him. "I purchased that vehicle completely in cash. 3 years before I ever met David," I explained, looking directly at my husband, whose smug expression was rapidly beginning to melt into confusion. "It is entirely paid off. There is no lien holder. There is no loan. The title is solely and exclusively in my legal name. David's singular contribution of paying the monthly insurance premium does not grant him or his mother a single ounce of ownership over my property." David's jaw dropped open. He looked at his mother, panic suddenly flooding his eyes. He had assumed, with the typical arrogance of a trust fund heir, that because he managed the household bills, he owned everything in it. He had never actually bothered to check the paperwork on the car he so confidently claimed as his own. The lead officer folded the title and handed it back to me with a respectful nod. He turned his attention back to Patricia, all traces of polite patience completely gone from his demeanor. "The vehicle belongs exclusively to this woman," he said, pointing a stern finger at Patricia. "You have no legal claim to it. Hand over the keys." Patricia crossed her arms tightly over her chest, lifting her chin in stubborn, petulant defiance. "No," she hissed. "I am not giving her anything. She is a disrespectful leech, and I am keeping the car as compensation for the emotional distress she has caused my family tonight." I looked at the lead officer, my posture rigid, my expression wiped clean of any remaining emotion. "Officer, I am officially reporting a stolen vehicle," I said, clearly, ensuring the body camera caught every single syllable. "That woman forcibly snatched my car keys from my hand without my consent. She is currently holding them hostage in her pocket, and she is unlawfully detaining my property. I want to press charges immediately." The officer's radio crackled in the silence. He unclipped his handcuffs from his belt, the heavy metal rings clinking sharply against each other. The sound echoed through the foyer like a death knell for Patricia's arrogance. "Mrs. Wilson," the officer growled, taking a decisive, threatening step toward her. "You have exactly 5 seconds to hand over those keys. If you refuse, you will be placed under immediate arrest for grand theft auto. You will be handcuffed, read your rights, and transported to the county jail in the back of my cruiser." Patricia froze. The color drained completely from her face, leaving her perfectly applied makeup looking like a grotesque mask. She looked at the heavy steel handcuffs glinting in the officer's hands. She looked at her son, who was actively shrinking backward, refusing to intervene or defend her. She looked at Beatrice, who had pressed herself flat against the stone fireplace, desperate to avoid catching any collateral damage. Patricia was entirely out of moves. Her wealth could not stop the officer from arresting her on the spot. The deep, profound humiliation that washed over Patricia was absolute. Her hands began to shake violently. She reached into the pocket of her expensive tailored slacks, her fingers fumbling with the metal ring. She pulled out my keys, the small silver fobs catching the light of the chandelier. Instead of handing them to the officer, Patricia locked her eyes onto mine, her gaze burning with a hatred so pure and toxic it was almost suffocating. With a sharp, furious grunt, she threw the keys violently at the marble floor. They bounced off the expensive stone and skidded directly to a halt at the toes of my winter boots. "Take your pathetic car and get out," Patricia spat, her voice trembling with defeated rage. My father calmly stepped forward and scooped the keys off the marble floor. He handed them to me, a fierce, proud smile touching the corners of his mouth. "You are going to need more than an attitude adjustment, Patricia," my father stated, his voice ringing with quiet, devastating authority. "Because tomorrow morning my legal team is going to dismantle your son's trust fund, and Tara is taking everything she is owed. We are done here." I turned my back on the ruined family, holding my son tightly to my chest, and walked out the shattered front doors into the freezing, liberating winter storm. The biting wind immediately whipped across my face, but the freezing temperature felt like absolute salvation compared to the toxic, suffocating air inside that mansion. My father walked closely behind me, his massive frame acting as a physical shield against the howling blizzard. The lead police officer and the CPS caseworker followed us out onto the grand stone porch, leaving the shattered remnants of the mahogany doors behind them. Before descending the icy marble steps, the lead officer turned back toward the destroyed foyer. He pointed a rigid, unyielding finger directly at Patricia, who was currently slumped against the decorative velvet armchair, shivering with humiliated rage. He delivered a final, razor-sharp warning about the severe criminal consequences of wasting emergency resources. He made it crystal clear that if they ever weaponized the authorities again with another fabricated malicious report, Patricia would leave the estate in handcuffs. We walked down the long, winding driveway. The unmarked black sedan and the two local police cruisers backed slowly down the path, their tires crunching loudly over the fresh snow. Their flashing red and blue strobe lights painted the blizzard in frantic alternating colors before finally fading out of sight, leaving the sprawling estate plunged back into the quiet isolation of the severe winter storm. My father had left his heavy-duty truck idling near the front gates. The massive engine rumbled with a deep, powerful hum, and the interior was wonderfully blasted with heat. I opened the heavy passenger door and climbed inside, carefully securing Leo into his plush, warm car seat in the back. The baby let out a soft, contented sigh, completely unharmed and blissfully unaware of the absolute war that had just been waged for his safety and his future. The contrast between the lethal cold of the blizzard and the protective warmth of my father's vehicle was profound. I finally let out a long, shaky breath, allowing my muscles to relax for the very first time that night. Just as I reached to pull the heavy passenger door shut, a frantic, desperate movement caught my eye. David burst through the shattered front doors of the mansion. He was not wearing a winter coat. He wore only his expensive tailored silk shirt and lightweight dress slacks, but the biting, freezing wind did not seem to register over his wounded, fragile ego. He looked completely unhinged. The crushing humiliation of being publicly dismantled by a pediatrician, threatened with arrest by the local police, and thoroughly emasculated by his own father-in-law had completely broken his mind. David stomped down the snowy marble steps, slipping slightly on the ice. His face was twisted into a mask of vicious, pathetic desperation. He could not handle losing. He could not handle the reality that the woman he had spent years subjugating had just outmaneuvered his wealthy, powerful family. He marched directly toward the open door of my father's truck, violently grabbing the frozen metal frame with his bare hands to prevent me from closing it. "You think you have won," David spat, his voice cracking as he tried to shout over the roaring wind. He sneered, a deeply ugly, malicious expression that warped his handsome features into something monstrous. He leaned his upper body into the warm cabin of the truck, desperate to crush my newfound confidence. "You think because you manipulated a few gullible cops and waved a stupid car title around that you are suddenly untouchable. You are absolutely nothing without this family, Tara." I sat comfortably in the heated leather seat, looking down at the man I had once promised to spend my life with. The sheer clarity of the moment was breathtaking. He was not a partner. He was a parasite entirely dependent on his mother's wealth and completely terrified of a woman finding her own strength. I did not raise my voice. I did not break my calm, icy stare. My father stepped up right behind David, casting a massive, intimidating shadow over him, ready to physically rip him away from the truck if he made a single sudden movement. "I am taking my son, and I am taking my vehicle," I stated, my voice projecting clearly over the storm. "And starting tomorrow morning, my legal representation will begin the meticulous process of extracting every single dollar I am legally owed from our marriage. You and your mother are going to learn exactly what happens when you try to legally destroy a mother." David threw his head back and laughed. It was a manic, cruel sound that sliced right through the howling wind. It was the chilling laugh of a man who believed he had already delivered the fatal, inescapable blow. "Every single dollar you are owed," David mocked, stepping even closer to the cab of the truck, his eyes burning with predatory, vicious delight. He wiped a mixture of melting snow and sweat from his forehead. "You really think you are walking away from us with a massive payout? You think you are going to hire a high-powered attorney and bleed my trust fund dry?" My stomach dropped. A sudden icy knot formed in my chest that had absolutely nothing to do with the winter weather. David saw the micro-expression of panic flash across my eyes, and he fed on it like a starving animal. "Take your stupid car!" David yelled, stepping back into the blizzard and throwing his arms wide open in absolute arrogant victory. "But you have nothing else." I checked our joint savings today. "You have exactly $200 left." The air was sucked completely out of my lungs. That joint savings account held every single paycheck I had earned during the early years of our marriage, back before Patricia had graciously demanded I leave my career to become a full-time mother. It was our emergency fund. It was the only financial safety net I possessed in the entire world. I withdrew the $150,000 we had saved. David screamed over the roaring wind, his face twisted into a mask of pure sadistic triumph. "And I invested it all into my mother's private fund. You are penniless." I did not cry. I did not fall to my knees in the snow or scream into the howling wind. When David proudly announced that he had drained every single penny of our joint savings, the last remaining shred of the man I once loved simply disintegrated into the winter air. I looked at him standing there in the freezing blizzard, shivering in his expensive silk shirt, and I felt absolutely nothing but pure crystalline ice. The number echoed in my head. $150,000. It was not a random accumulation of wealth. It was not a down payment for a summer home or a retirement nest egg. I stepped away from the warmth of my father's truck, the heavy snow instantly clinging to my eyelashes, and I walked slowly back toward my husband. "You transferred the $150,000? I stated, my voice dangerously quiet, slicing cleanly through the roar of the winter storm. "You went into the bank today, bypassed the dual authorization mandate, and wired the exact balance directly to your mother." David smirked, crossing his arms tightly over his chest to ward off the biting cold. He entirely misread my terrifying calm for defeat. Every last cent he bragged, his breath pluming in the icy air. "It is a marital asset, Tara. I have every right to protect my money from a hysterical woman who is trying to abandon her family and steal my son." "That was not general savings, David." I said, my words dropping like heavy anvils onto the ice. "That was the medical escrow account. That was the exact amount Dr. Thorne quoted for Leo's specialized pediatric cochlear surgery. The surgery scheduled in exactly 21 days to save your son from permanent, irreversible hearing loss." The smug, triumphant smile physically slid off David's face. For a fraction of a second, the horrifying reality of what he had just done pierced through his thick skull. He had not just outsmarted his wife. He had literally robbed his disabled infant. He had drained the singular lifeline our son possessed. He opened his mouth, stammering, his eyes darting frantically toward the snowy ground. "The surgery can wait," David mumbled weakly, the arrogant bravado suddenly draining from his spine. "My mother has a top-tier broker. She said she could double the money. We will pay for the procedure later." Patricia, who had been watching the exchange from the ruined threshold of her grand foyer, immediately stepped out onto the snowy porch to shield her precious son from the consequences of his own monstrosity. She wrapped a thick designer cashmere shawl tightly around her shoulders, glaring down at me with unadulterated disgust. "Do not speak to my son in that tone," Patricia commanded, her voice dripping with elitist venom. David made a brilliant financial decision. I moved those idle funds into an exclusive, high-yield private investment portfolio. It is going to generate substantial dividends for the family trust. That is something a dropout like you could never comprehend. She sneered the word, rolling it around in her mouth like a weapon. A dropout. Patricia repeated, her voice echoing rhythmically against the towering stone pillars of the mansion. You never finished your master's degree, Tara. You walked away from your higher education to play house and drain my son's resources. You are nothing but a dropout. Just a dropout who understands absolutely nothing about wealth management, asset allocation, or how the real world operates. The insult pulsed through the freezing air. A dropout. Just a dropout. She used the word repeatedly, wielding it like a verbal whip to beat me back into submission. She wanted me to feel small, stupid, and entirely dependent on her generational wealth. She wanted to construct a psychological cage where I was the foolish, uneducated peasant, and she was the financial mastermind. She wanted me to break down in the snow and beg her for the money back. But her rhythmic insult did not shatter me. It anchored me. I stood in the blizzard and looked at this miserable, greedy woman who would gleefully sacrifice her own grandson's hearing just to inflate her investment portfolio and feed her insatiable ego. I looked at the husband, who was so terrified of his mother's disapproval that he willingly handed over his child's medical fund without even reading the basic terms of the private account. You locked his medical funds into a high-yield private portfolio, I asked, my voice deadly and precise. Do you even know what the maturation period is on that specific tier of investment? David? David swallowed hard, looking helplessly up at his mother on the porch. He had no idea. He had just blindly signed the wire transfer to appease the tyrant who controlled every aspect of his miserable existence. It is a 5-year lock, I informed him, the words striking him like a physical blow. You cannot withdraw a single dollar without incurring a 60% early withdrawal penalty. You just traded your son's ability to hear my voice for a percentage point in your mother's bank account. You stole his surgery money to make her happy. The boy will be perfectly fine, Patricia yelled over the wind, completely dismissing the severe medical reality of her own flesh and blood. He does not need a $150,000 surgery right now. It is an unnecessary luxury. He can get basic hearing aids. A dropout like you just wants to waste our hard-earned money on dramatic, unnecessary medical procedures. You are a dropout, Tara. Accept your place in this family and accept that we control the finances. They stood there wrapped in their wealth and delusion, utterly convinced they had trapped me. They believed they had severed my wings and chained me to their estate forever. But as I turned my back on them and walked toward the idling truck, a fierce, burning energy ignited in my chest. They thought they knew everything about my finances. They thought the joint savings account was my only lifeline. They had spent years calling me a dropout, underestimating my intelligence, and treating me like a charity case. Patricia truly believed that because I stayed home to care for Leo, I had stopped earning, stopped working, and stopped growing. They had absolutely no clue what I had been quietly building behind their backs while they slept. I stopped dead in my tracks. The heavy passenger door of my father's truck remained wide open, the industrial heater blasting warm air into the freezing blizzard, but I did not climb inside. I pivoted sharply on my heel. I marched directly back toward the grand stone porch, the snow crunching violently beneath my winter boots. My father fell into step right beside me, a silent, menacing bodyguard radiating pure intimidation. David actually stumbled backward as I approached, his arrogant smirk collapsing into sudden, confused panic. I did not stop at the shattered doorway. I forced them to retreat. Step by deliberate step, I backed David and Patricia through the ruined mahogany doors, across the waterlogged Persian rug in the foyer, and straight into the center of their pristine, formal living room. I stopped right in front of Patricia's prized, custom-made glass coffee table. The roaring fire in the stone hearth cast long, frantic shadows across the high walls. You think you ruined me, David? I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm, slicing cleanly through the crackling of the fire. I unslung the heavy diaper bag from my shoulder and reached back into the concealed waterproof lining. I pulled out a thick, folded stack of documents. I peeled back the top page, revealing a heavily redacted, highly official corporate bank statement. I tossed it effortlessly. The thick paper landed with a sharp smack directly in the center of the glass coffee table. "Read it," I commanded. David hesitated, looking nervously at his mother, before slowly leaning over the glass table. His eyes scanned the top of the corporate document. Then his gaze hit the bottom line. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He looked as if all the oxygen had been violently sucked from his lungs. He could not speak. He could only stare at the bold black numbers printed on the page. Patricia, deeply annoyed by his sudden paralysis, snatched the paper right off the table. She shoved her reading glasses up the bridge of her nose and her eyes darted across the printed balance. She froze. Her manicured fingers began to tremble so violently that the crisp paper rattled loudly in the dead silence of the room. The vicious elitist matriarch looked completely short-circuited. $8 million, I stated, letting the massive valuation echo off the vaulted ceilings. That is the current fully audited market valuation of my company. It is a corporate entity registered under an ironclad LLC, and I am the sole 100% equity owner. I took a slow step closer, forcing Patricia to look me directly in the eye. "You loved calling me a dropout, Patricia." I continued, my tone dripping with absolute venom. "You loved telling your wealthy country club friends that I was a lazy, uneducated leech draining your son's resources. You loved making me the punchline to your elitist jokes. But I did not drop out of my master's program because I was stupid or lazy. I dropped out because the traditional academic route was moving entirely too slow for the massive market gap I discovered." I turned my piercing gaze toward my husband, who was currently shrinking into the expensive upholstery of the sofa. "For 4 years, while you both thought I was sitting at home being a useless, financially dependent housewife, I was quietly building an e-commerce empire. I designed, patented, and manufactured a specialized line of highly profitable ergonomic baby gear. It is called Rising Sun. We currently supply 3 major national retail chains and ship inventory to 14 different countries globally. I manage a remote team of 30 employees, a global supply chain, and international logistics directly from my laptop while my son takes his afternoon naps." David stared at me, his mouth hanging open in absolute shock. "You are lying," he breathed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic whisper. "There is no physical way. If you had that kind of money coming in, I would have seen it in the bank accounts. I monitor all the finances. I pay the bills." I let out a sharp, genuinely amused laugh. It was a cold sound that made David physically flinch. "You monitor exactly what I allowed you to monitor, David," I corrected him. "Did you honestly believe that $150,000 was my entire life savings? That joint account you drained today was nothing but a calculated decoy." I stepped around the glass coffee table, invading his personal space. "I knew exactly how fragile your ego was. I knew you desperately needed to feel like the big, powerful provider while simultaneously keeping me financially trapped and submissive. Your toxic masculinity required you to hold the purse strings. So I set up a direct deposit from my corporate dividends to feed that joint account every single month. I let you manage it. I let you pay the insurance and the utilities. I let you play king of the castle. I literally funded your pathetic illusion of control just to keep you completely complacent and out of my business affairs." Patricia's shock suddenly morphed into greedy, frantic desperation. The realization that millions of dollars were sitting right in front of her completely overrode her pride. "If you built this while married to my son," Patricia shrieked, her eyes gleaming with sudden manic calculation, "then it is a marital asset. David is legally entitled to half of everything. 50% of an $8 million company belongs to this family." "Wrong again, Patricia," I replied, my voice coated in pure ice. "I incorporated Rising Sun as a separate legal entity in Delaware, completely insulated by an irrevocable blind trust established long before I ever signed a marriage license with your son. I paid a team of ruthless corporate attorneys an exorbitant amount of money to ensure that neither David nor you, nor your greedy family trust could ever touch a single dime of my intellectual property or my corporate dividends. David's name is on absolutely nothing. He has zero legal standing, zero sweat equity, and zero claim. Patricia let out a strangled gasp, her hands gripping the edges of the glass table as if the floor had dropped out from under her. She had spent years trying to financially control a woman who could have bought and sold her entire estate before breakfast. And the absolute best part, David, I whispered, leaning in close so only he could hear the final devastating blow. By draining that specific account today, you did not bankrupt me. You just handed my legal team the ultimate inescapable weapon. I stood back up, addressing them both with unwavering authority. You initiated an unauthorized unilateral wire transfer of funds that were explicitly and legally earmarked for pediatric medical care. You committed financial abuse and medical sabotage against a disabled infant. When a family court judge sees that you stole your own son's cochlear implant fund to invest in your mother's private portfolio, you will be stripped of your parental rights instantly. You just traded your child for a tiny fraction of what I make in a single financial quarter. I picked up my diaper bag, securing it over my shoulder. Keep the $150,000, Patricia, I said, walking back toward the shattered doorway. Consider it my final payment for taking out the trash. I did not even make it 3 steps toward the shattered doorway before the profound silence in the room violently snapped. The sheer magnitude of the number I had just dropped onto that glass table finally penetrated David's thick skull. The absolute terror of facing a furious wife and a stolen medical fund evaporated. It was instantly replaced by a sickening feral greed. "Wait!" David gasped, his voice cracking loudly as he scrambled around the edge of the glass coffee table. He practically tripped over the expensive Persian rug to block my path to the door. The panic was completely gone from his eyes. Instead, they were blown wide, his pupils dilated with a sudden, intoxicating rush of adrenaline. $8 million, David repeated, rolling the words around in his mouth as if he were tasting fine wine. A slow, deeply disturbing smile spread across his face. He reached out, attempting to gently grab my arm. He was instantly shifting from a snarling, abusive tyrant back to the charming, manipulative salesman I had foolishly married a decade ago. "Tara, baby. Hold on a second," David cooed, his tone dripping with a sudden suffocating affection that made my skin crawl. "Let us not do anything rash here. You are incredibly upset about the medical fund. I get it. I overstepped. I was just trying to secure our future. But listen to what you just said. $8 million. We are rich, Tara. We never have to worry about anything ever again." I yanked my arm out of his grasp as if he had physically burned me. David did not even flinch at my obvious disgust. He was entirely consumed by the math running frantically through his head. He stepped closer, puffing out his chest, his arrogant posture returning with an absolute vengeance. "You can play all the corporate shell games you want," David said, his voice dropping into a smug, authoritative register. "You can set up all the Delaware LLCs and blind trusts you can afford to buy. But at the end of the day, we are legally married. We live in an equitable distribution state. Every single asset you built during the course of this marriage is marital property. By law, I own exactly half of that company. $4 million belongs to me." Before I could even open my mouth to dismantle his pathetic legal delusion, a new voice pierced the room. Beatrice peeled herself off the stone fireplace where she had been cowardly hiding during the entire police confrontation. The scent of millions of dollars had magically cured her paralysis. Beatrice marched directly into the center of the room, crossing her arms and glaring at me with profound, unearned entitlement. "You have been sitting on $8 million while I have been stressing over my destination wedding," Beatrice demanded, her voice shrill and indignant. I had to downgrade the floral arrangements for my Amalfi Coast reception because David said the family trust was currently illiquid. "You have been hiding family money this entire time." The sheer audacity of her logic was breathtaking. She genuinely believed my hard-earned corporate valuation was her personal piggy bank. "Since you clearly deceived us," Beatrice continued, tapping her designer heel on the rug, The least you can do is write a check for the remaining balance of my luxury vacation and my wedding planner. It is barely $80,000. Consider it an apology for lying to this family for 4 years. We can overlook the disrespect if you just pay your fair share." Patricia, still clutching the redacted bank statement, quickly nodded in agreement. "She is right," Patricia commanded, her elitist superiority flaring back to life. "You utilized resources while living under my son's roof. That corporate valuation belongs to the family trust. You will fund your sister-in-law's wedding immediately." I looked back and forth between the three of them. They were completely severed from reality. They had spent years treating me like an uneducated burden, actively working to keep me financially destitute and totally submissive. Yet the literal second they smelled my success, they immediately tried to cannibalize it. They viewed me as property, and by extension they viewed my massive wealth as their rightful inheritance. I let out a sharp, genuine laugh. It echoed loudly off the high ceiling, stopping their greedy, pathetic demands dead in their tracks. "You really think a dropout like me would build an $8 million empire without consulting the absolute best asset protection attorneys in the country?" I asked, looking directly into David's greedy, desperate eyes. "I knew exactly who I was married to. I knew you would try to steal it the second you found out." I reached back into the waterproof lining of my diaper bag and pulled out one final document. It was a heavily watermarked legal contract. I slapped it firmly against David's chest. He reflexively grabbed it before it hit the floor. "Read the second paragraph, David," I commanded. "Read it out loud so your sister can hear exactly why her Amalfi Coast wedding is going to feature discount flowers." David's eyes darted down the page, his jaw clenched tight. The muscles in his neck jumped, but he refused to speak. "Read it," I demanded, my voice cracking through the room like a whip. "The aforementioned corporate entity," David muttered, his voice trembling violently as he read the dense legal jargon, "was established using initial seed capital, inherited exclusively from the maternal grandfather's protected lineage trust. Therefore, the entity and all subsequent dividends remain strictly classified as non-marital separate property under state law. The asset is entirely immune from spousal claims, equitable division, or community property rights." The silence that followed was absolute and devastating. I had not used a single penny of our joint money to start Rising Sun. I had used a tiny, forgotten inheritance from my late grandfather. It was a sum so insignificant that David had scoffed at it years ago and told me to buy myself some nice shoes. Instead, I bought domain names, manufacturing prototypes, and global trademarks. I built a fortress that David could never legally breach. "You do not own half of my company, David," I stated, stepping right into his personal space, forcing him to look at me. "You do not own a single share. You do not own the chair you are sitting on, the clothes on your back, or the breath in your lungs, unless your mother pays for it. You are a 35-year-old dependent. I am a self-made CEO. We are not the same." I turned my attention to Beatrice, whose mouth was currently hanging wide open in shock. "And Beatrice," I said, my tone dripping with absolute ice, "if you want an $80,000 vacation, I highly suggest you get a job, because the Bank of Terra is permanently closed." David crumpled the legal document in his hands, his face turning a mottled, furious shade of red. The realization that he was completely locked out of a multi-million-dollar fortune broke him in a way the police presence never could. The illusion of his superiority was completely dead. He was standing in front of a woman who had entirely outgrown him, outsmarted him, and out-earned his entire precious family trust. "You cannot do this!" David hissed, his voice vibrating with absolute helpless rage. "You cannot just walk away with millions and leave me here. I am your husband. I am the father of your child. You stopped being a father the exact second you stole Leo's surgery money," I replied, my voice completely devoid of any remaining emotion. "You are just a man I used to know." I turned around and grabbed the heavy brass handle of the shattered front door. The blizzard was still raging fiercely outside, the wind howling violently across the dark estate. But as I stepped over the ruined threshold and out into the freezing night, heading toward my father's waiting truck, I did not feel the cold. I felt absolutely, undeniably invincible. I did not even make it down the first icy marble step before David's desperate, furious voice chased me into the blizzard. I will hire the most vicious divorce attorneys in the entire state. David screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria as he stumbled out onto the porch. I will drag you through a decade of litigation. You cannot hide an $8 million marital asset from me. Half of that company is mine by law. Tara, I will take everything from you. I stopped. The freezing wind whipped my hair across my face, stinging my cheeks, but I did not shiver. I slowly turned around, stepping back under the grand shattered archway of the front doors. David was panting heavily, his face flushed with manic hope. He genuinely believed he still had a legal leash wrapped tightly around my neck. He thought his sheer entitlement could override reality. I did not need to hire a vicious divorce attorney to protect my assets, David. I stated, my voice echoing coldly off the stone walls of the porch. Your mother already provided the absolute best legal protection money could buy. I unzipped the hidden side pocket of my diaper bag for the final time. I reached past the extra pacifiers and baby wipes and pulled out a thick, slightly yellowed legal document bound by a heavy brass staple. It was 5 years old, but I had kept it in pristine condition for this exact moment. I walked right back into the destroyed foyer and slapped the heavy packet directly against David's chest. Recognize this? I asked, watching his eyes dart down to the embossed legal seal on the cover page. David stared at the thick stack of papers, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. Patricia, however, instantly recognized the heavy blue binding of her personal high-priced law firm. She gasped, taking a sudden, unsteady step backward, her hand flying to her throat. That is our prenuptial agreement, I announced, ensuring every single person in the room heard me clearly over the storm. 5 years ago, exactly 3 weeks before our wedding, Patricia cornered me in this very foyer. She handed me a pen and told me that if I did not sign this exact document, the wedding was permanently canceled. I looked directly at Patricia, whose face was rapidly draining of all color. She looked as if she were going to be violently ill right there on the Persian rug. You were absolutely terrified, Patricia, I continued, my voice dripping with vindictive satisfaction. You were practically hyperventilating at the thought of a poor, uneducated dropout marrying your precious heir. You were entirely convinced I was a gold digger, plotting to steal David's trust fund. So you paid your ruthless corporate lawyers thousands of dollars to draft the most ironclad, merciless prenuptial agreement in the history of this state. You wanted to make absolutely sure I would leave this family with nothing. David was flipping frantically through the pages, his hands shaking so violently he was tearing the heavy parchment paper. Read Section 4, subsection B, I instructed him coldly. The specific clause your mother relentlessly demanded to ensure I could never touch a single dime of your family money. David found the page. His eyes scanned the dense legal text. His lips parted, but no sound came out. He looked like a man who had just read his own death warrant. The arrogant bravado was completely wiped from his existence. Read it aloud, David Sly demanded. Let your mother hear exactly how her brilliant legal strategy played out. David swallowed hard, his voice reduced to a pathetic, trembling whisper. Any business entity, corporation, or intellectual property founded entirely with separate non-marital capital shall remain the exclusive 100% property of the founder. He stopped reading, his knees visibly buckling under the weight of the realization. Keep going, I commanded. Read the very next sentence. Such assets are entirely immune from community property division, spousal support claims, or equitable distribution in the event of a divorce. David choked out the document, slipping from his trembling fingers and fluttering to the floor. I smiled. It was a wide, triumphant smile that reached all the way to my eyes. You dug your own son's grave, Patricia, I said, turning my gaze back to the matriarch. You were so blinded by your own arrogance, so obsessed with protecting your wealth from the peasant, that you legally walled David off from my empire. You forced me to sign a document that guarantees I walk away with 100% of Rising Sun. You legally protected my $8 million. I could not have asked for a better asset protection strategy. Thank you for your paranoia. Patricia completely lost her mind. The pristine, composed socialite shattered into a million hysterical pieces. She let out a blood-curdling shriek, her hands flying to her hair, as she began to pace frantically around the living room. "No!" She screamed, her voice shrill and deafening. "That is not valid. We will void it. We will claim you hid assets, you deceived us, you tricked me." "You cannot void a contract you drafted, Patricia," I replied smoothly. "My corporate lawyers have already reviewed it. It is entirely bulletproof. You played yourself." Patricia was hyperventilating, kicking the pieces of the shattered front door, screaming absolute nonsense at the vaulted ceiling. David was staring at the floor, completely catatonic, realizing he had just lost $4 million because he never had the spine to stand up to his mother. Beatrice was openly weeping on the sofa, mourning the loss of her free luxury vacation. But amidst Patricia's unhinged screaming and the absolute destruction of the Wilson family ego, another figure finally moved. Jamal, Beatrice's husband, had been standing silently near the back of the room for the entire evening. He was a highly successful, sharply observant African-American investment banker. He was a man who rarely spoke during the family's toxic outbursts, preferring to quietly analyze the chaos from the sidelines. But right now, his eyes were not on me, nor were they on his hysterical mother-in-law. They were fixed directly on the glass coffee table. While David and Patricia had been losing their minds over the prenup, Jamal had quietly stepped forward. He reached down and picked up the wire transfer receipt David had dropped earlier. The receipt detailing the $150,000 David had stolen from Leo's medical fund to invest in Patricia's exclusive, high-yield private account. Jamal was staring at the printed receipt, his brow deeply furrowed in intense concentration. He flipped the paper over, checking the banking seals, and then stared incredibly hard at the account destination line. The silence emanating from him was sudden and heavy, cutting through Patricia's hysterical shrieking like a knife. Jamal slowly looked up from the paper. The quiet, passive brother-in-law was entirely gone. His dark eyes were wide, filled with a sudden, horrifying realization that sent a fresh wave of tension crashing through the room. He looked directly past David. He looked straight at his mother-in-law. "Patricia," Jamal said, his deep, commanding voice cutting through the room with absolute, terrifying clarity. The entire room went dead silent. Patricia stopped her frantic pacing, turning to look at him with wide, mascara-stained eyes. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. Jamal held the wire transfer receipt up in the air, his eyes locked onto Patricia with lethal, unblinking intensity. "Patricia," Jamal repeated, stepping forward. "What is this routing number?" Patricia's eyes darted frantically around the room. The color that had just drained from her face was suddenly replaced by a flushed, blotchy panic. She opened her mouth, closed it, and took a rigid step backward away from her son-in-law. "It is simply an offshore holding account, Jamal." Patricia stammered, her voice completely losing its signature aristocratic authority. "It is an exclusive high-yield family portfolio. It is entirely above your pay grade. Hand the receipt back to David right now." Jamal did not move a single muscle. He held the thin piece of paper up to the firelight, his dark eyes scanning the printed digits with lethal precision. He was not just a quiet husband dragged to insufferable family dinners. Jamal was a senior compliance officer for one of the largest international banking conglomerates on the East Coast. Tracking fraudulent financial routing, offshore tax evasion, and illegal wire transfers was his literal profession. "I know an offshore routing prefix when I see one," Patricia, Jamal stated, his voice dropping an octave, radiating absolute, unwavering authority. "And I also know that this specific sequence of digits does not belong to any legitimate institutional wealth management firm. This routing number traces back to a high-risk, unregulated crypto exchange based in the Cayman Islands." Beatrice suddenly launched herself off the velvet sofa. She marched across the room, her designer heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. "Give me that piece of paper right now," Jamal, Beatrice shrieked, reaching out with manicured claws to snatch the document directly from his hand. "This is a private Wilson family financial matter. You have absolutely no right to interfere with my mother's investments. Mind your own business and stay out of this." Jamal did not even flinch. He simply shifted his weight and physically blocked her, raising his left arm like a solid brick wall to deflect her grasping hands. Beatrice collided with his forearm and stumbled backward, letting out a dramatic gasp of indignation. When a wire transfer involving a stolen pediatric medical fund occurs in my immediate presence, it becomes my business, Beatrice. Jamal snapped, his eyes flashing with a terrifying, righteous fury. Do not ever attempt to snatch a piece of financial evidence out of my hand again. He turned his back on his sputtering wife and walked purposefully toward the heavy oak console table resting against the far wall. He unlatched his leather briefcase, the metallic clicks echoing loudly in the silent room. Patricia was practically vibrating with terror. She took a stumbling step toward him, her hands trembling violently. Jamal, I demand you put that away! Patricia ordered, her voice escalating into a frantic, high-pitched screech. You are a guest in my son's house. You will not interrogate my personal finances. Jamal completely ignored her. He pulled a sleek silver laptop from the briefcase and flipped it open. The glowing screen illuminated his sharp, focused features. He bypassed the standard internet browsers and immediately booted up a highly secure, encrypted corporate compliance database. David, finally breaking out of his catatonic shock regarding the prenuptial agreement, looked back and forth between his mother and his brother-in-law. The sheer confusion on his face was almost comical. Mom, what is he talking about? David asked, his voice weak and completely devoid of its usual arrogance. You told me that was a secure family trust account. You promised me a guaranteed 12% quarterly return. You said the principal was completely safe. Shut up, David! Patricia hissed, her eyes wild and frantic. Do not say another word to him. Jamal's fingers flew across the keyboard with blinding speed. He typed in the exact routing sequence, followed by the specific tax identification numbers printed on the wire transfer receipt. He hit the enter key. The entire room waited in agonizing, suffocating suspense as the database processed the international financial query. I stood silently by the shattered front doors, watching the absolute destruction of the Wilson family unfold in real time. For 4 years they had mocked me. They had treated me like a useless, uneducated parasite. They had actively conspired to keep me financially trapped and submissive. Now they were tearing each other apart over the very money they had stolen from my disabled infant. The poetic justice was incredibly satisfying. A sharp chime echoed from Jamal's laptop. The search results had populated. Jamal leaned in closer to the screen. His eyes darted rapidly across the glowing text. A deep, heavy silence fell over him. The righteous anger that had fueled him moments ago was suddenly replaced by pure, unadulterated disgust. He slowly shook his head, pushing the laptop slightly away from him. He turned around and leaned against the oak table, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at David. Then he looked at Beatrice. Finally, he locked his piercing gaze directly onto Patricia. There is no high-yield private wealth fund. Patricia, Jamal stated, his voice ringing out with crystal-clear finality. There is no exclusive family portfolio. There is no guaranteed quarterly return. What are you talking about? David demanded, taking a hesitant step forward, his voice cracking with rising panic. I sent her $150,000 an hour ago. Where did the money go? Jamal let out a harsh, humorless breath. It went straight into a massive, unregulated offshore gambling syndicate, Jamal revealed, dropping the absolute bombshell into the center of the room. Your mother did not invest your stolen money, David. She wired it directly to a blacklisted digital casino network. Beatrice let out a strangled, horrified gasp, clapping both hands over her mouth. David looked as if he had just been physically struck by a freight train. He staggered backward, gripping the edge of the glass coffee table to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor. That is a lie, Patricia shrieked, her voice tearing through the room like shattered glass. He is lying. He hacked the system. He is trying to frame me. The database does not lie. Patricia, Jamal countered, his tone absolute and unyielding. You have been funneling money into this specific offshore gambling syndicate for over 3 years. I am looking at the historical transaction ledgers right now. The account you sent David's money to is completely empty. The funds were instantly transferred and liquidated the second they hit the Cayman Islands server. The $150,000 is entirely gone. David let out a guttural, agonizing sound. It was the sound of a man watching his entire life disintegrate. You lost it. David breathed, his eyes wide with absolute horror, staring at his mother as if she were a monster. You gambled away my son's surgery money. You gambled away everything I had left. Patricia was backing away, shaking her head frantically. She was backed completely into a corner, her pristine socialite mask entirely destroyed, exposing the desperate, addicted fraud underneath. She had spent years judging everyone else's financial status, masking her own catastrophic gambling addiction by draining her family dry. I had to do it! Patricia cried out, tears of genuine panic finally streaming down her heavily made-up face. I was down. I just needed one more large deposit to win it all back. The algorithm was primed. I was going to double the family trust. You bankrupt fraud, Jamal spat out, slamming the laptop shut with a sharp, violent crack. You do not even have a family trust anymore, do you? You drained it. That is why Beatrice had to downgrade her wedding. That is why you were desperate enough to manipulate David into stealing from his own disabled child. You are completely broke. Beatrice slowly turned her head to look at her mother. The realization that her lavish lifestyle, her expensive wedding, and her entire inheritance had been gambled away on a digital roulette wheel finally sank in. She let out a piercing, devastated scream and collapsed onto the velvet sofa, sobbing uncontrollably. David slowly stood up straight. His fists were clenched tight at his sides. The absolute rage radiating from him was palpable. He had betrayed his wife, stolen from his infant son, and committed a severe financial crime, all to please a mother who had instantly thrown his money into a digital incinerator. I stood quietly by the doorway, adjusting the heavy strap of my diaper bag over my shoulder. The destruction was complete. I had absolutely nothing left to say to these people. I turned my back on the screaming, the sobbing, and the financial ruin. I stepped out into the freezing blizzard, the cold air hitting my face like a breath of absolute freedom. Beatrice lunged forward, her designer heels sinking deeply into the wet Persian rug as she tried to slap the paper directly out of her husband's hand. "Mind your own business," Jamal, Beatrice shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly in the tense room. "That is my mother's private wealth fund. You have absolutely no right to interrogate her financial decisions in my brother's house. Give that back right now." Jamal did not even flinch. He easily caught Beatrice by the wrist, physically blocking her frantic swipe with the cold, immovable posture of a man who dealt with white-collar criminals for a living. As a high-level compliance lawyer for a major international bank, Jamal possessed a radar for financial fraud that bordered on a sixth sense. He gently but firmly pushed his wife's hand away, never breaking eye contact with Patricia. When a wire transfer receipt lists a 9-digit routing sequence that corresponds to a flagged offshore shell corporation, it becomes my business, Beatrice, Jamal stated, his voice dropping into a register of pure, terrifying authority. Patricia was visibly trembling now. Her manicured fingers gripped the edge of the sofa, as if the floor had suddenly dropped out from beneath her. "Jamal, please," Patricia stammered, the arrogant elitism entirely stripped from her tone. "It is just a specialized tax shelter. You know how these wealth management firms operate. It is highly confidential." Jamal ignored her entirely. He turned on his heel, walked straight over to the mahogany console table, and unlatched his heavy leather briefcase. He pulled out his silver laptop, opening it right there in the center of David's destroyed living room. The glow of the screen illuminated Jamal's sharp, unreadable features as his fingers flew across the keyboard. "What are you doing?" David demanded, his voice cracking as the reality of his stolen $150,000 began to set in. "Jamal, what is wrong with the account?" Jamal did not answer immediately. He was logged into a secure financial database running the specific routing numbers and tax identification codes printed clearly on David's wire transfer receipt. The silence in the room was suffocating. Only the frantic tapping of the keyboard and the howling blizzard outside could be heard. I had my hand on the heavy brass doorknob of the shattered front entrance, completely mesmerized by the spectacular implosion unfolding before me. The heavy oak door suddenly pushed open from the outside. My father, William, stepped into the foyer, shaking the heavy snow from his winter coat. He took one look at the screaming, panicked faces in the living room, crossed his arms over his broad chest, and stood silently right beside me. We watched the carnage together, completely untouched. A sharp chime echoed from the laptop speakers. Jamal stopped typing. He stared at the screen for a long, agonizing moment. When he finally looked up, his face was an unreadable mask of professional fury. "There is no private wealth fund," Jamal announced, his voice slicing through the room like a scalpel. "The tax identification number on this receipt belongs to a Shell LLC registered in a jurisdiction known for laundering illicit assets. This is not a wealth management firm. This is an illegal Ponzi scheme." David actually staggered backward, hitting the edge of the glass coffee table. "A Ponzi scheme." David repeated, all the oxygen rushing out of his lungs. "No. She has a portfolio. She showed me the quarterly statements. Those statements are fabricated." David Jamal explained, his tone completely devoid of sympathy. "I deal with this exact type of fraud every single day. She creates fake balance sheets to show massive returns. She uses that fake success to lure in new money from her wealthy country club friends. When older investors ask for their quarterly payouts, she takes the cash from the new investors to cover the dividends. It is a classic textbook fraud pyramid, and it just collapsed." Patricia let out a strangled, pathetic gasp, covering her face with her hands. "Because she spent it all," Jamal revealed, pointing an accusing finger at Patricia. "I ran the secondary routing numbers attached to this LLC. The capital is not sitting in an investment portfolio. It is being directly funneled into high-stakes offshore gambling accounts and luxury credit lines. Your mother has a catastrophic gambling addiction. I was going to pay it back." Patricia cried out, tears of genuine panic finally streaming down her face. "I just needed a bridge loan, David. The algorithm was about to hit. I was going to double the family trust." Jamal's eyes suddenly narrowed as he scrolled further down the transaction ledgers on his glowing screen. He froze. "Wait!" Jamal said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly whisper. He looked up from the screen, his dark eyes locking directly onto his wife. "Beatrice, why is your individual tax identification number listed on this offshore ledger?" Beatrice turned the color of absolute chalk. She took a frantic step backward, shaking her head rapidly. Jamal hit a few more keys, his jaw clenching so hard the muscles visibly jumped. $200,000, he read aloud, his voice vibrating with absolute shock and rage. $200,000 was wired from our joint savings account into this exact same shell corporation exactly 4 weeks ago. "Beatrice, what did you do?" Beatrice burst into hysterical, hyperventilating sobs. "Mom said she needed liquidity," Beatrice wailed, her voice cracking. "She promised me a 20% return before the wedding. I just wanted to upgrade the Amalfi Coast villa. I was going to put it right back. You gave your mother our life savings without telling me?" Jamal roared, his booming voice shaking the crystal chandelier above us. "You secretly handed over $200,000 to a gambling addict." Beatrice entirely backed into a corner, and desperate to deflect her husband's furious wrath, spun around and aimed her hysterical fury directly at her brother. "You idiot!" Beatrice shrieked at David. She marched across the room and viciously slapped David right across the face. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot in the vaulted room. "You gave her the last of the cash. If you had not sent her that $150,000, she could have paid me back. You ruined my wedding." David, his cheek bright red and his eyes wild with unhinged fury, shoved his sister backward hard enough to make her stumble into a plush armchair. "I ruined your wedding," David screamed, his voice breaking into a manic pitch. "You secretly drained your husband's bank account, you greedy parasite. I just lost $4 million in a divorce and you are crying about floral arrangements." Patricia, realizing her entire life was completely destroyed and federal prison was a very real possibility, let out a feral, desperate scream. She lunged across the coffee table, diving directly toward Jamal. "Shut it down," Patricia shrieked, clawing frantically at the silver laptop. "Delete the records. You are breaching client confidentiality." Jamal easily sidestepped her frantic, uncoordinated attack. Patricia slammed hard into the oak console table, sending expensive porcelain vases and silver-framed photographs crashing to the hardwood floor in a massive shower of shattered glass. Jamal snatched his laptop out of her reach, his face twisting with absolute unfiltered disgust. The pristine, elitist facade of the Wilson family was entirely eradicated. The toxic family alliance had shattered into a million irreparable pieces. They were literally cannibalizing each other right in front of us. Beatrice was screaming and swinging her fists wildly at David. David was shoving her away, cursing his mother for destroying his life. Patricia was weeping hysterically on the floor among the broken glass, begging Jamal not to call the federal authorities. It was a symphony of pure destruction, fueled entirely by their own unadulterated greed, narcissism, and toxic entitlement. My father stood beside me, his steady presence an anchor in the storm. He reached out and gently placed his large, warm hand on my shoulder. "Ready to go home, kiddo?" My father asked quietly, his eyes fixed on the pathetic brawl unfolding on the Persian rug. I smiled, a deep, genuine smile of absolute closure. I watched the people who had tortured me for 4 long years finally tear each other to shreds over vanished money. "Yes, Dad," I replied, turning my back on the mansion forever. "I am finally ready." I had barely taken 2 steps toward the freezing threshold, my hand resting securely on my father's arm, when a sound like a wounded animal ripped through the vaulted ceiling of the foyer. My father and I stopped in our tracks. We slowly turned around, the howling wind of the blizzard whipping my hair across my face. The absolute carnage unfolding in the living room was impossible to walk away from. The pristine, elitist facade of the Wilson family was not just fracturing, it was completely vaporizing into primal, vicious chaos. Patricia scrambled up from the shattered porcelain and broken glass littering her expensive Persian rug. Her immaculate designer gown was torn at the shoulder, and her perfectly sprayed hair was sticking up in wild, frantic angles. The composed, untouchable socialite was completely dead. In her place stood a cornered feral predator, whose entire universe had just collapsed inward. She turned her manic mascara-stained eyes toward her son. David was rocking back and forth on his knees, clutching his head in his hands, muttering about prison and federal wire fraud. "Stop crying like a pathetic child, David!" Patricia shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria. She kicked a piece of shattered glass toward him. "Stand up!" I raised a Wilson. "Not a coward. You act as if your life is over. Over a minor liquidity issue. A minor liquidity issue." David screamed, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred as he looked up at his mother. "You stole my son's medical fund. You lost $4 million. You dragged me into a federal crime to feed a slot machine in the Cayman Islands. You ruined me. I gave you everything," Patricia roared back, spit flying from her lips as she leaned over him. "Every luxury, every car, every connection you have is because of my name. You are nothing without me. You are too weak to control your peasant wife, and you are too weak to handle a temporary financial setback." Beatrice, who had been hyperventilating on the velvet sofa, suddenly lunged forward. Her face was streaked with black makeup, her designer heels abandoned somewhere in the wreckage. "You stole $200,000 from my marriage," Beatrice wailed, pointing a trembling accusatory finger directly at her mother's chest. "I trusted you. I lied to Jamal for you. You told me it was a guaranteed bridge loan. How am I supposed to pay for the villa in Italy? How am I supposed to face my friends?" Patricia spun around, her eyes flashing with a toxic, vindictive cruelty that made even me hold my breath. "Oh, shut up, Beatrice." Patricia spat, her upper lip curling in absolute disgust. "You vain, greedy little parasite. You have never worked a single day in your miserable life. Who paid for your designer bags? Who paid for your cosmetic surgeries?" "I did. You owed me that, 200,000. It was a fraction of what you have leached off this family." Jamal stepped in front of his wife, his massive frame shielding Beatrice from her mother's venom. He was holding his phone in his left hand, the screen brightly illuminated with the dial pad already pulled up. "You are going to prison," Patricia Jamal stated, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that carried over the screaming. "I am reporting this entire offshore syndicate to the federal authorities right now. I am submitting the routing numbers, the tax identification codes, and the transaction ledgers. You are a financial terrorist, and I will personally make sure you spend the rest of your miserable life in a federal penitentiary." Patricia lunged at him. She threw her body across the glass coffee table, her manicured claws raking through the air as she tried to violently smash Jamal's phone out of his hand. Jamal easily sidestepped her frantic, uncoordinated attack. Patricia crashed heavily onto the cushions of the sofa, letting out a breathless shriek of absolute unhinged frustration. She was completely cornered. Her son hated her. Her daughter was screaming at her. Her son-in-law was actively preparing to destroy her freedom. Her entire social standing, built on lies and stolen cash, was entirely eradicated. But instead of surrendering, instead of showing a single ounce of remorse, Patricia's ego violently rejected reality. She snapped. She pushed herself up from the sofa and stood dead center in the middle of the ruined living room. She threw her arms out wide, chest heaving, her eyes burning with a manic, delusional superiority. "So what?" Patricia screamed at the top of her lungs, her shrill voice echoing off the grand vaulted ceilings. "So what?" The room fell into a stunned, heavy silence, broken only by Beatrice's quiet sobbing. "Nobody is suing me yet," Patricia declared, her chest puffing out with artificial, arrogant pride. "You have no proof that will hold up in a real court. I am Patricia Wilson. I am untouchable. And I still own this estate." She stomped her foot hard against the hardwood floor, gesturing wildly to the massive stone walls and the crystal chandeliers hanging above them. "You are all standing on my property!" she shrieked, pointing a furious, trembling finger at Jamal, then at David, and finally directly at me. "I will sell this mansion. I will pay it all back, and I will rebuild my empire. And you will all rot. Get out of my house. Get out of my house." Her hysterical screaming bounced off the walls, a desperate, pathetic attempt to reclaim a throne that no longer existed. She truly believed that this multi-million-dollar property was her ultimate, unbreakable shield. She believed the brick and mortar around us made her invincible. Beside me, my father let out a slow, quiet breath. William had stood silently by the doorway for the entire evening. He was a humble, hard-working mechanic. He was a man who worked with his hands, a man Patricia had relentlessly mocked, belittled and treated like absolute garbage since the day David and I got engaged. She had spent years looking down her nose at him, disgusted by his simple clothes and his quiet, unpretentious demeanor. My father gently removed my hand from his arm. He took a single deliberate step forward, walking back into the grand foyer. He did not yell. He did not scream. He simply reached down and slowly began buttoning his simple, inexpensive winter jacket. The quiet, methodical sound of the metal buttons snapping into place somehow managed to cut through Patricia's manic, heavy breathing. Patricia turned her wild eyes toward him, ready to unleash a fresh wave of venom at the working-class man daring to stand in her foyer. But the words died in her throat. My father reached into the deep inner pocket of his jacket. He withdrew a thick, heavy stack of crisp white legal parchment paper. The documents were bound by a heavy black clip, and the front page was stamped with a massive, undeniable red legal seal. He held the thick stack of papers out in front of him. His weathered, calloused hands were completely steady. He looked at the screaming, delusional socialite with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. "Are you sure this is your house, Patricia?" Patricia stared at the heavy legal documents in my father's calloused hand, her manicured fingers twisting into claws. The hysterical, shrill defiance had suddenly evaporated, replaced by a cold, creeping realization that the very ground beneath her was giving way. "What is that?" Patricia demanded, her voice barely a whisper, completely devoid of its usual arrogant command. "What are you holding, William?" My father did not smile. He did not gloat. He simply unfolded the thick red stamped parchment and held it up to the firelight, the embossed seal glowing like a warning beacon in the center of the room. "You spent 4 years treating me like an uneducated peasant, Patricia." My father stated, his voice a low, steady rumble that commanded the entire room. "You assumed that because I wear work boots and own a mechanic shop, I was beneath your notice. You assumed I was just a blue-collar nobody who didn't understand how real wealth operates." He took a slow, deliberate step forward, walking directly onto the ruined Persian rug. "But you see," my father continued, his eyes locked onto the terrified matriarch, "my automotive repair business is just a hobby. My actual company is one of the largest distressed debt purchasing firms in the state. We specialize in acquiring toxic defaulted liabilities from major financial institutions." Jamal, still standing by the mahogany console, let out a sharp, sudden bark of laughter. He crossed his arms over his chest, staring at my father with a newfound expression of profound professional respect. He instantly recognized exactly what was happening. Patricia, however, looked completely blank. The technical financial terminology was entirely lost on her. She only understood the superficial optics of wealth, not the brutal mechanics of debt. "What does that even mean?" Beatrice cried out from the sofa, her voice shrill with panic. "What is he talking about, Mom?" "It means," my father explained, turning his steady gaze toward my hysterical sister-in-law, "that your mother did not just drain your savings accounts to feed her offshore gambling addiction. She also secretly triple mortgaged this entire estate to keep her fraudulent Ponzi scheme afloat. And 6 months ago, when the country club money completely dried up, she defaulted on all 3 of those loans." David let out a guttural, suffocated sound, backing away from his mother as if she were carrying a contagious disease. "The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings 30 days ago." My father revealed, his voice echoing with absolute undeniable finality. "They bundled the toxic debt and sold it off to the highest bidder at a distressed asset auction. My firm purchased the entire portfolio exactly 48 hours ago. The ink on the deed transfer dried this morning." My father tossed the heavy stack of legal documents onto the glass coffee table right next to Jamal's silver laptop. The thick parchment landed with a dull, heavy thud that sounded like a coffin lid slamming shut. "You do not own this mansion, Patricia," my father stated, buttoning his inexpensive winter coat with quiet, unpretentious dignity. "You do not own the Persian rug you are standing on. You do not own the crystal chandeliers above your head. I legally own this estate. I am your landlord. And as of this exact moment, you are formally evicted." My father's words hung in the freezing air of the living room, heavy and absolute. Patricia stared at the red stamped documents resting on the glass coffee table, her eyes wide and completely uncomprehending. "You cannot do this," Patricia gasped, her voice trembling violently as she clutched the torn fabric of her designer gown. "There are laws. There is a legal process. You have to give me a 90-day notice. I am a citizen with rights. You cannot just throw me out into a blizzard." My father let out a harsh, humorless scoff. He reached forward and tapped the thickest document in the stack with his calloused index finger. "Under normal circumstances, yes, you would have 90 days, my father explained, his tone completely devoid of sympathy. "But you did not secure these mortgages legitimately, Patricia. You leveraged this property using falsified balance sheets, fraudulent tax returns, and phantom assets from your offshore shell corporation. That elevates this from a standard financial default to severe federal bank fraud." Jamal nodded grimly from the sidelines, keeping his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He is right. When criminal fraud is tied directly to the collateral, the lender has the absolute right to bypass the standard grace period. The asset is seized immediately to prevent the destruction of financial evidence or the illegal liquidation of the property contents. "The bank filed for an emergency asset seizure," my father continued, his voice ringing with quiet, unshakable authority. "When my firm purchased your distressed debt, we purchased that emergency court order right along with it. This is not a standard foreclosure. This is an immediate court-mandated eviction." David let out a pathetic, suffocated whimper, sinking onto the velvet sofa next to a sobbing Beatrice. The devastating realization that they were all about to be thrown out into a freezing winter storm with absolutely nothing was finally taking hold. The freezing wind howled through the shattered front doors, swirling snow across the Persian rug, but nobody moved. Patricia's knees visibly buckled. She swayed desperately, grabbing the edge of the mahogany console table to keep from collapsing onto the hardwood floor. The grand, untouchable matriarch was completely broken. Her elitist empire of lies had collapsed, burying her under the rubble of her own greed. I stepped forward, moving past my father and Jamal. I stopped just inches away from Patricia. She slowly raised her head, her mascara-stained eyes meeting mine. There was no arrogance left in her gaze, only raw, unadulterated terror. For 4 years, this woman had made it her absolute mission to remind me that I was an uneducated peasant. She had endlessly mocked my background, insulted my father, and constantly threatened to throw me out onto the street if I did not obey her commands. The psychological loop was finally completing itself. "You told me I should be grateful you let me live here," I said, my voice echoing coldly in the silent room. I held her terrified gaze, refusing to let her look away. "You spent 4 years reminding me that I was just a lucky guest on your property. Now I am the owner, and you are the trespasser." Patricia opened her mouth to speak, a desperate plea forming on her lips, but I raised my hand, silencing her instantly. "I will give you exactly 30 minutes to pack your personal clothes," I commanded, pointing directly toward the grand mahogany staircase. "Be grateful I let you take those. Leave the jewelry, leave the art, and leave everything else. Your time starts right now." David stared at the heavy legal documents on the coffee table as if they were venomous snakes. The arrogant, entitled golden child was completely broken. The generational wealth he had been promised, the multi-million-dollar safety net he had relied on his entire life, was entirely gone. His mother was a federal criminal. His marriage was destroyed. And the working-class father he had mocked for years now owned the very ground he was standing on. David's knees simply gave out. He collapsed onto the ruined Persian rug, surrounded by shattered porcelain and broken glass. He crawled forward on his hands and knees, ignoring the sharp shards cutting into his designer slacks. He scrambled directly toward me, reaching out with trembling hands to grab the hem of my coat. "Tara, please!" David sobbed, his face a contorted mask of pure, absolute desperation. "Please, you have to listen to me. I did not know. I swear to God, I did not know she was running a Ponzi scheme." I looked down at the pathetic weeping man kneeling at my feet, the man who had humiliated me, isolated me, and allowed his mother to torture me for 4 long years. "Do not touch me, David," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet whisper. David snatched his hands back as if he had been burned, but he kept pleading, the words spilling out of his mouth in a frantic, hysterical rush. "She manipulated me!" "Tara?" David wailed, pointing a shaking finger back at Patricia, who was still frozen in absolute terror by the console table. "She told me the medical fund was just sitting in a low-yield trust. She said she could double it. She said she was doing it for Leo. I was just trying to protect our son. You have to believe me. We can fix this. We can start over. Please, Tara, I love you." I did not yell. I did not scream. I simply reached into the inside pocket of my coat and pulled out a manila envelope. I had carried this envelope in my car for exactly 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment. The moment had finally arrived. I opened the envelope and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. I held them up, looking down at David with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "These are divorce papers, David," I stated, my voice echoing coldly through the vaulted room. "They are already signed and notarized by my attorney. I am filing them first thing tomorrow morning." David let out a choked, suffocated gasp, shaking his head rapidly. "No. No, Tara, please. We have a son. You cannot take my son away from me." "You do not have a son anymore, David," I replied, my tone completely devoid of sympathy. "I am filing for absolute sole legal and physical custody of Leo." "You cannot do that!" David shrieked, his voice cracking into a hysterical pitch. "No judge will grant you sole custody. I am his father. I have rights. You have absolutely nothing." "David?" I corrected him, dropping the divorce papers directly onto the floor in front of his knees. "You are unemployed. You are entirely broke. You just admitted to willingly transferring your son's medical trust into an illegal offshore shell corporation. That makes you an accessory to federal wire fraud. No family court judge in this country is going to grant custody to a homeless, unemployed accessory to a federal crime." David stared at the divorce papers resting on the broken glass, his entire body shaking violently. He let out a low, guttural moan, burying his face in his hands as the absolute reality of his destruction finally broke him completely. A sudden flashing red and blue light cut through the howling blizzard outside. The bright, strobing colors illuminated the massive frosted windows of the grand foyer, casting chaotic, sweeping shadows across the walls of the living room. The heavy, unmistakable wail of approaching sirens echoed over the roaring wind. Patricia, who had been completely paralyzed by the console table, suddenly snapped back to reality. She spun around, her eyes wide with absolute primal panic as she stared at the flashing lights illuminating the snow-covered driveway. "What is that?" Patricia gasped, her voice barely a shrill squeak. "Who called the police?" Jamal slowly closed his silver laptop. The sharp click of the latch echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. He picked up his briefcase, his massive frame radiating cold professional authority. "I did not call the local police," Patricia Jamal stated, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "I called the federal authorities." Beatrice, who had been weeping silently on the sofa, suddenly let out a horrified shriek. "Jamal, what did you do?" "I did my job," Beatrice Jamal replied, not even looking at his wife. He kept his dark, unwavering gaze locked entirely on Patricia. "When I saw the secondary routing numbers attached to that offshore shell corporation, I recognized the jurisdiction immediately. It is a flagged zone for international money laundering. I immediately compiled the digital transaction ledgers, the falsified balance sheets, and the triple mortgaged loan defaults." Patricia was hyperventilating now, clutching her chest as if she could not draw enough oxygen into her lungs. "You breached client confidentiality," Patricia shrieked, taking a desperate, frantic step toward Jamal. "You cannot do this. You are a lawyer. You will be disbarred." "I am a compliance officer for a major international bank." Patricia Jamal corrected his tone, dripping with absolute disdain. "You are not my client. You are a criminal. And under federal law, I am legally obligated to report suspected international wire fraud." I forwarded the entire compiled audit directly to the FBI field office and the IRS White Collar Crimes Division exactly 20 minutes ago. Patricia let out a feral, strangled scream. She stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the mahogany console table. The heavy oak door of the grand entrance suddenly shook as someone began pounding aggressively on the heavy brass knocker. "Federal agents," a booming, authoritative voice echoed through the heavy wood. "Open the door immediately." Patricia looked at the door. She looked at Jamal. She looked at the red-stamped foreclosure notice resting on the coffee table. The entire empire she had built on lies, manipulation, and stolen cash was completely gone. She had no money, no home, no family, and no escape. Patricia's knees buckled. She did not catch herself this time. She collapsed heavily onto the cold marble floor of the foyer, her immaculate designer gown pooling around her in a pathetic heap. She curled into a fetal position, her manicured hands clutching her hair as she let out a long, unbroken wail of absolute, unhinged despair. My father and I did not stay to watch the federal agents break down the door. We did not need to. The toxic, elitist empire of the Wilson family was entirely eradicated. They were broken, penniless, and facing federal prison. I turned my back on the screaming matriarch, the weeping golden boy, and the shattered mansion. I walked out the side door with my father, stepping into the freezing, howling blizzard. The cold air hit my face, sharp and biting, but for the first time in 4 years, I did not feel the chill. I felt completely, absolutely free. The freezing, howling blizzard of that night slowly melted away, dissolving into the quiet, distant archives of my memory. 6 months later, a crisp, brilliant spring morning broke across the city. Golden sunlight poured through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my executive suite, casting warm, geometric patterns across the polished oak floorboards. The air inside the room was immaculate, smelling faintly of expensive espresso and fresh linen. I stood by the glass, looking out over the bustling downtown skyline, feeling the gentle heat of the sun seeping into my skin. The heavy, suffocating darkness of the Wilson estate was entirely gone. In its place stood the sleek, towering headquarters of Rising Sun, the corporate empire I had built with my own 2 hands, my own vision, and my own unbreakable will. I turned away from the breathtaking city view and walked back toward the center of the expansive office. My heels clicked with quiet rhythmic authority against the hardwood floor. Just a few feet away from my massive custom-designed mahogany desk, Leo was playing happily. He was sitting on a brightly colored premium ergonomic playmat surrounded by soft building blocks and interactive learning toys. His bright, healthy laughter echoed off the high ceilings, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy that filled the entire executive suite. His cheeks were flushed with healthy color, his eyes wide and curious as he stacked two soft blocks together and clapped his tiny hands in triumph. The crippling fear that had haunted me for years regarding his medical treatments was permanently eradicated. His medical trust was not just fully restored, it was heavily fortified, secured in an ironclad portfolio that no one could ever touch. I knelt down, pressing a soft kiss to the top of his head, breathing in the sweet, clean scent of baby shampoo before stepping back up to my desk. Sitting directly across from me at the polished glass conference table was Jamal. He looked entirely transformed. The heavy, invisible burden he had carried while surviving inside the toxic ecosystem of the Wilson family had vanished from his shoulders. He was wearing a sharp, impeccably tailored navy blue suit. His posture relaxed, his eyes alert and focused. The tense, rigid compliance officer who had shielded his wife from her own mother's venom was gone. Jamal was officially divorced. The moment the federal agents had raided the Wilson estate, he had handed Beatrice the separation papers. Beatrice, stripped of her stolen inheritance and her artificial social standing, had attempted to fight the divorce, but Jamal had left her with absolutely nothing. He had walked away from the wreckage of that family with his dignity and his brilliant legal mind completely intact. Now he sat across from me, not as a brother-in-law, but as the highly paid chief legal counsel of Rising Sun. The final acquisition contracts for the downtown expansion are fully vetted and ready for your signature. Jamal stated, his voice a low, steady rumble of professional confidence. He slid a thick, meticulously organized leather folder across the glass table. I have also finalized the patent protections for the new software integration. Nobody can touch our proprietary data. You are completely bulletproof on all fronts. I picked up the custom engraved silver pen resting on my desk and smoothly signed my name on the dotted lines. I pushed the folder back toward him, a quiet mutual respect flowing between us. We had both survived the fire, and we had both emerged infinitely stronger. Have there been any updates from the federal prosecutor regarding the bankruptcy proceedings? I asked, keeping my tone entirely conversational. Jamal neatly stacked the signed documents and placed them inside his leather briefcase. He leaned back in his ergonomic chair, a faint, satisfied smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The asset liquidation was completed yesterday morning, Jamal replied smoothly. Patricia's primary trial begins next month, but her defense attorney has already signaled that they are pursuing a plea deal. She is facing a mandatory minimum of 15 years in a federal penitentiary for the wire fraud and international money laundering charges. David is currently living in a weekly motel on the outskirts of the city, working night shifts at a fulfillment center to pay off his court-mandated restitution. His wages are being garnished at 40%. I listened to the clinical, absolute destruction of the people who had tried to ruin me, and I felt absolutely nothing. There was no anger left. There was no lingering resentment. They had dug their own graves and now they were buried in them. They were completely irrelevant to my reality. Good, I stated, simply dismissing the Wilson family from my mind forever. Before Jamal could review the next agenda item, the heavy frosted glass door of my executive suite swung open. My father walked into the room. He was no longer wearing the scuffed, grease-stained winter jacket of a humble mechanic. He was dressed in a pristine charcoal gray tailored suit that commanded immediate respect, radiating the quiet, unbreakable power of a man who owned the very ground he walked on. Despite the multi-million-dollar corporate attire, he still carried himself with the exact same grounded, unpretentious warmth that had defined him my entire life. In his hands, he carried 2 steaming cups of artisan coffee. I thought the CEO might need a caffeine refill before the afternoon board meeting. My father announced, his deep voice filling the bright room with a comforting, familiar warmth. He walked past Jamal, giving him a firm, respectful nod, and stepped around the playmat. He paused to gently ruffle Leo's hair, prompting a delighted squeal from my son, before stepping up to my desk and handing me the hot cup. I wrapped my fingers around the warm cardboard sleeve, breathing in the rich, dark aroma of the coffee. I looked at my father. I looked at Jamal, confidently reviewing the corporate expansion plans. I looked down at my beautiful, healthy son, playing safely in the sunlight. My father met my gaze. He did not say a word, but the deep, shining pride in his eyes spoke volumes. A slow, warm, victorious smile spread across my face, and my father mirrored it perfectly. I was no longer the outcast. I was no longer the uneducated peasant. I was no longer the scapegoat forced to bow her head and swallow the cruel, vindictive poison of a fraudulent dynasty. The world they had tried to lock me out of was now a world I owned entirely. I had taken the absolute worst they had to offer, and I had used it to build a fortress. I took a slow sip of my coffee, turning my chair to face the brilliant skyline shining through the glass. I was the absolute queen of my own empire, and my reign had only just begun.